How does one family build an empire vast enough to reshape an entire nation? And what remains when that empire crumbles like salt into the sea? This is the story that unfolds across nearly 2 centuries of American history, beginning not with mansions or marble halls, but with the sound of wooden oars cutting through fog-wrapped water on the Hudson River at first light. Picture it now. The year is somewhere in the early 1800s, and New York Harbor emerges slowly from darkness and mist. The fog hangs so thick that the world seems to contain only water and the faint shapes of boats. You can almost feel the damp air, cool and salt-tinged, carrying the smell of brine and wet wood and something else, something alive and industrial, barely nascent, waiting to be born. The wooden ferries creak against their moorings, ropes straining, hulls settling and rising with the gentle undulation of the tide. Each creak is a small song, repeated over and over, a rhythm as old as seafaring itself. And then the seagulls. They call to one another through the mist, their voices sharp and insistent, indifferent to the world of human ambition, beginning to stir on these docks. The first light touches the harbor's edge in shades of pearl and silver. Lanterns still burn in some of the dock buildings, their glow amber and warm against the grey blue of approaching dawn. Fishermen move quietly among the boats. Workers begin to arrive, breath visible in the cool air, hands already busy with the work of tying, loading, preparing. This harbour, this exact harbour, with its fog and its creaking wood and its calling birds, is the world into which the Vanderbilt story emerges, not from inherited titles or old money, but from the water itself, from the ferry boats that carry people back and forth across the rivers that separate Brooklyn and Staten Island and Manhattan, from the ambition of young men who watch these boats and see not merely transportation, but possibility, from the salt smell of commerce and the sound of oars and the vast, patient tidal pull of a city that is beginning to understand its own power. If you find yourself drawn to this world, to the slow unfolding of wealth and power, told not as a story of excess and scandal, but as a quiet, intimate history of how one family shaped the sinews of a nation, then I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the Vanderbilt Empire documentary series, where we take you through slow, richly researched histories like this one, where the pace is meant to carry you deeper into understanding rather than rushing you toward conclusions. Each episode descends slowly, as we will now descend together into the fog and the water and the beginning. The harbour grows slightly lighter, a bell tolls somewhere, the kind of bell that marked the hours in early New York, the kind that measured out the day in bronze. You might wonder what made this particular harbour, this particular time, so fertile for the rise of a single family. What combination of circumstance and ambition and sheer relentless will could build something that would last not for decades, but for generations? On Staten Island, in a modest home overlooking these very waters, a boy was born in 1794 into a world that seemed to promise him nothing but a quiet farmer's life, or perhaps, if fortune smiled, the work of a ferryman like his father before him. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. The world would come to know him as the Commodore, a title he would earn not through naval service, though the name suggests it, but through his dominion over the waters themselves, through his ability to move people and goods and ideas from one shore to another, faster than anyone else, with an efficiency that bordered on ruthlessness. But that understanding, that future, was still far away. In these early hours, in the fog that wrapped the harbour like a blanket, Cornelius Vanderbilt was simply a boy who watched the boats come and go, a boy who listened to the creaking of the wood and the calling of the gulls and the low voices of men planning their days. A boy who, perhaps, understood something that others around him did not, that these waters connected everything. That movement, mastered, was power itself. The fog begins to lift, almost imperceptibly. The harbour's edges become slightly clearer. More boats become visible, their shapes emerging from the mist, like memories becoming more distinct. The sun continues its slow climb. The day is properly beginning now, though the pace of it is slow, measured, calm. The lanterns in the buildings are being extinguished, no longer needed. Fresh light replaces them. What we are witnessing, in this moment before the story truly accelerates, is the world that Cornelius Vanderbilt inherited, not in terms of property or fortune, but in terms of geography and possibility. The east coast of America, in the early 19th century, was a place of water and commerce. The rivers were the highways, the boats were the vehicles of progress. Anyone who could control the passage between one place and another held a kind of quiet power. They controlled access, they controlled speed, they controlled the flow of human life itself, measured in fares and schedules and the constant movement of people seeking to get from one shore to another. The boy on Staten Island, watching from his family home, was watching the greatest opportunity of his age. He simply didn't know it yet. Or perhaps he did, and that is why his eyes were so often on the water, why his mind was always working out angles and advantages, why he could sense, even then, that his life would be written not on the quiet streets of Staten Island, but on these waters, in these boats, in the vast and expanding networks of commerce that were beginning to web the young nation together. Listen to the harbour now. The mist is thinner. The day is truly arriving. Can you hear, underneath the familiar sounds, the creaking, the calling of gulls, the voices of workers, something else, a faint, distant sound, almost like breathing. It is the sound of steam, barely present, a technology that has only recently arrived in America. Steam engines, steam power, the future, arriving quietly, almost unnoticed, in the fog of a New York dawn. It is the sound that will define not just Cornelius Vanderbilt's life, but the life of the entire family and the nation itself. The sound of the industrial age, of progress, of fortunes waiting to be built by those bold enough to harness it. The harbour settles into the rhythm of a working day. The mist rises into the sky, becoming part of the air itself, and the water reveals itself, vast, patient, full of traffic and movement, and the endless human need to cross from one place to another. Somewhere in this scene, among the boats and the voices and the quiet labour of morning, the Vanderbilt Empire begins, not with a dramatic gesture or a grand declaration, but with a boy watching the water and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that his life could be something more than the lives of those who came before him. There is something that draws us to stories of empires built from nothing, isn't there? The fog rolling across that harbour you've just imagined carries with it the weight of a question that has captivated people for more than 2 centuries. How does one person, starting with so little, come to reshape an entire nation? The Vanderbilts were not born to the halls of old money. They were not descended from colonial dynasties or Revolutionary War generals. They were, in many ways, ordinary people who saw the future arriving in steam and steel and seized it with both hands. What we're about to explore together is not merely a chronicle of wealth accumulation, though there will be great numbers to contemplate, fortunes so vast they reshape our understanding of what money itself might mean. Rather, this is a meditation on ambition, on the restless human drive to build, to expand, to leave something permanent behind. It is also a story woven through with the quieter lives of thousands, the workers, the dreamers, the people whose labor and sacrifice form the invisible foundations beneath marble halls and coastal estates. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of slow, deeply researched journey through the undercurrents of American history, where we linger on the small sensory details, the overlooked human moments, the gentle unraveling of how power and fortune actually move through generations, I'd invite you to subscribe. There are many more of these immersive histories waiting, each one designed to carry you deeper into the American story at your own unhurried pace, allowing the texture and complexity of the past to settle around you like a familiar blanket. The beauty of understanding the Vanderbilts is not in arriving quickly at some conclusion, but in drifting through the landscape they shaped, noticing as we go the traces of their presence in places you may have walked without knowing their significance. A train line that still follows the same route Cornelius mapped, a building in Manhattan that stands where one of his competitors once struggled, the names of institutions that carry the family legacy forward into a world they could never have fully imagined. So let us begin not with the fortune, but with the beginning, with a young man on an island that is now part of New York City, watching the boats come and go, sensing something in the rhythm of commerce and the movement of people that the adults around him could not quite perceive. Let us move into that time as if we ourselves were there, our eyes adjusting to the early light, our ears catching the creak of timber and the call of birds, preparing ourselves to witness how one family's ambition would eventually touch nearly every corner of the nation, changing not only the landscape, but the very way Americans understood distance, time, and the possibility of their own futures. The story of the Vanderbilt Empire begins quietly, with no fanfare, with no understanding on anyone's part of what would follow. It begins with motion and water, and the kind of young restlessness that cannot be satisfied by standing still. And from that beginning, everything else unfolds. The steamships, the railroads, the mansions, the social battles, the arranged marriages, the fortunes split among heirs, until they fractured into 1,000 different directions. Each of these threads is part of the larger tapestry, and as we weave through them together, you may find yourself thinking differently about the cities you inhabit, the infrastructure that moves you from place to place, the public institutions that bear the Vanderbilt name, and the invisible economics that shaped the America we know today. There is comfort in understanding where things come from, in knowing the human stories that precede our own. And so we settle into this narrative not as passive observers, but as quiet companions to history, allowing the details to accumulate, the picture to deepen, the smaller moments of human striving to remind us why these stories have endured, and why, even now, we remain fascinated by them. The year was 1804, and on Staten Island, in a modest house within sight of the Kill Van Kull Strait, a boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt was learning to read the water in ways that no schoolbook could have taught him. His father, Phoebe Hand Vanderbilt, and her husband before her, had established themselves as ferry operators, and young Cornelius, called Cornel by those who knew him in his childhood years, spent his early mornings standing at the edge of the dock, watching the sky change from deep indigo to pale grey to the soft gold that came with dawn. The air smelled of salt and wet rope and something else, something indefinably New York, the smell of commerce stirring, of the day's first boats being prepared, of tar and timber and the centuries-old rhythm of waterborne trade that would pulse through his veins for the rest of his life. Staten Island in the early 1800s was not yet the crowded borough that the modern world knows. It was quieter then, more pastoral, with farms rolling inland and the water's edge serving as the true measure of the world. The Kill Van Kull was narrow enough to cross by ferry, and it was this crossing that became the stage for one of history's greatest fortunes. Imagine, for a moment, the sensory world that young Cornelius inhabited, the creak of wooden hulls in their cradles, the slap of water against the ferry's sides, the calls of boatmen to one another across the water, their voices carrying in that peculiar way that water carries sound, clear and far and somehow intimate at the same time. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and persistent, and the smell of fish markets hung in the morning air, mixing with wood smoke from the cook fires that warmed the ferry hands against the chill. His father's ferry operation was modest, nothing grand or commanding, but it was honest work, and it was profitable in a quiet, steady way. The Vanderbilts were not wealthy. Far from it, but they were industrious. And that industriousness was the gift that the father would pass to his son, along with something more intangible, an instinct for the water, a sense of what could be done with boats and commerce, and the relentless expansion of the young American city that was beginning to sprawl across Manhattan. Young Cornelius was born in 1894. Wait, let us correct ourselves, for the records are clear on this. He was born in the year 1894. No, that is not right either. The mind sometimes stumbles over dates as we drift deeper into memory. Cornelius Vanderbilt I was born in 1768. His son, our Cornelius, the one who would build the empire, was born in 1804. The year itself seems to matter less as we speak than the quality of that world, the sensory texture of early 19th century American life that shaped him. The boy, and he was a boy with a particular kind of restlessness in him, a quality that observers noted even then, did not remain content with the modest rhythms of family ferry work for long. Around the age of 16, in the year 1820, Cornelius borrowed a small boat from his parents. Some accounts say it was a periauger, a shallow-bottomed sailing vessel common to the waters around New York in that era. Others suggest it might have been a smaller scow or flatboat. The details blur slightly across the historical record, as such details often do, softened by time and the fog of competing accounts. What matters is this: he borrowed the boat, and with it he began to carry cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan, taking passengers where they needed to go, moving goods from one dock to another, inserting himself into the vast, intricate web of waterborne commerce that was beginning to transform New York from a colonial port into the nerve center of American trade. The ferry routes in those years were crowded with competitors, older boatmen, men who had spent decades learning the currents and tides, who knew every shallow bar and hidden rock in the harbor, regarded this young Vanderbilt with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He was bold in ways that seemed almost reckless to them, willing to take his small boat out in weather that made more cautious captains hesitate. He moved with a kind of muscular efficiency that suggested he was always calculating, always thinking not just about the immediate passage, but about the next one, the one after that, the vast accumulation of passages that might someday add up to something significant. What quality in a young man drives such ambition in an era when most would have been content with the simple security of family enterprise? Was it hunger, or was it something deeper? A recognition, perhaps, that the world was expanding, that New York was becoming something larger and more vital with every passing year, and that those with the courage to seize opportunity would be the ones remembered. The harbor itself was changing during these years. The morning fogs rolled in thicker and more frequently, or so it seemed to those who watched them, and they brought with them the smell of the open Atlantic, salt and distance, and the promise of trade routes stretching toward Europe, toward the Caribbean, toward the vast commercial networks that were stitching the world together. The water was darker then, less polluted by industry, though the industry was growing, the docks becoming longer and more complex, the vessels more numerous and more varied. Sloops and brigs and schooners crowded the anchorages, their hulls creaking with the rhythm of the tides, their rigging singing in the wind with a sound not unlike sleep itself, the gentle, repetitive sound of ropes and wood and water that seems to lull the mind toward rest, even as the story of human ambition unfolds above the decks. Young Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ferryman's son with restless eyes, was learning something that no formal education could have taught him. He was learning that the water was not merely a natural feature of the landscape, a beautiful and practical necessity, but a medium of power. Control of the water meant control of commerce. Control of the routes meant control of the wealth that flowed through them. And as he guided his small boat through the crowded harbor, as he learned every current and every shortcut, as he began to accumulate a reputation, not just as a reliable ferryman, but as someone with an unusual gift for anticipating the needs of merchants and passengers alike, He was beginning his education in the only school that would ever truly matter to him, the School of American Enterprise, written in salt water and wood and the endless human hunger for connection and profit that drives societies forward into their futures. The waters around Staten Island in those earliest years of the 1800s were not empty or peaceful in the way we might imagine them now. They were instead crowded with small boats and larger vessels, all jostling for the same routes, the same passengers, the same thin margins of profit that made survival on the water possible. Young Cornelius Vanderbilt, working his way up from that initial ferrying venture between Staten Island and Manhattan, quickly discovered that the waterways held not opportunity alone, but something far more volatile. Competition of a kind that demanded not just skill with a boat, but cunning, nerve, and an appetite for confrontation that seemed almost to match the strength of his own ambition. The ferry business, in those early decades of the 19th century, operated under what we might call a loose arrangement of informal agreements and gentlemen's understandings. Established boatmen, families who had worked these routes for decades, who had connections to the harbour masters and the shipping merchants, had come to regard the most profitable passages as something approaching their own property. They maintained these territories not through law, but through a combination of familiarity, reliability, and a willingness to discourage newcomers through various means. A rival boat might find itself mysteriously blocked from the best landing spots. Routes might become somehow less profitable when an outsider appeared. Word could spread through the dock workers and passengers that a new operator was unreliable, even if that was far from the truth. Vanderbilt's response, as it would remain throughout his life, was not to retreat or to seek accommodation. Instead, he studied the system with the same intensity he had applied to everything else, and he began to move through it in ways that older, more complacent competitors had not anticipated. If he could not secure premium routes through the informal networks that excluded him, he would create his own advantage through lower fares, more frequent service, and a reputation for punctuality that was almost obsessive. He arrived early and departed on time, even in weather that made other captains hesitate. He maintained his boats with a care that extended to every plank and line. He was present on the dock, visible to his passengers, building relationships that transcended the simple transaction of moving from one shore to another. There is something almost meditative about imagining this young man in those early years, perhaps in his 20s, moving through the routines of his work with this kind of methodical attention. The rhythm of daily service, the predictability of the tides and the schedules, the constant engagement with people from all walks of life, merchants and laborers, travelers and families. This created in him a kind of embedded knowledge of how commerce actually moved and how trust was built. And as his reputation grew, something began to shift in the balance of power on those same waters that had once seemed so firmly controlled by older hands. The conflicts that arose were not always polite or restrained. There were races between ferries, unofficial competitions to see which captain could make the faster crossing, which drew crowds to the docks and turned the waterways into informal theatres of rivalry. These races served a practical purpose. Faster crossings meant more profitable routes, but they also served something deeper in the culture of maritime work, a testing of skill and courage that commanded respect. Vanderbilt seems to have excelled at these contests, or at least to have won them with enough frequency that the races became associated with his name and his ambition. Witnesses recorded the sight of his ferries moving through the water with unusual speed, his crews responding to his commands with a coordination that other boats could not match. More significantly, Vanderbilt began to edge out competitors not just through his own skill, but through the strategic acquisition of better boats and the careful timing of his moves into new routes. When a competitor seemed entrenched in a particular passage, Vanderbilt would sometimes introduce such aggressive undercutting of fares that the older operator found the route no longer worth maintaining. There is something that historians find both troubling and impressive about these maneuvers. The ruthlessness was clear, yet it was also effective, and it operated in a space where the rules were still being written, where the American maritime commerce of the 19th century was establishing its own brutal logic of competition and consolidation. The sobriquet that would eventually follow him, the Commodore, emerged gradually from these years of accumulation and dominance. In naval tradition, a Commodore held a rank just below admiral, commanding a fleet of ships rather than a single vessel. The nickname, when it began to be applied to Vanderbilt, carried with it both respect for his accomplishments and a certain ironic acknowledgement of his ambitions. He did not yet command anything so grand as a true naval squadron, but the trajectory was already clear to anyone paying attention to the docks and the passenger lists. The younger boatmen began to defer to him. The established operators, one by one, either accommodated him or found their enterprises gradually marginalized. The waters that had once been divided among many small entrepreneurs were consolidating into the domain of a single commanding figure. What strikes those who study this period is the speed of the transformation and the way it seemed to operate according to principles that Vanderbilt himself understood intuitively, even if they had not yet been formally articulated in the business literature of the age. The concentration of transportation services into fewer, larger, more efficient operations would become a defining feature of American capitalism in the industrial era. But Vanderbilt was already enacting this logic on the ferries of New York Harbor, years before the full machinery of industrial consolidation would roll across the continent. He was learning, through daily practice, how to dominate a market, how to outmaneuver rivals through a combination of better service, strategic pricing, and an almost relentless focus on efficiency and control. And if there were moments, in those years of rising dominance, when he paused to reflect on what he was building, we do not have records of them. What we know instead is the external face of his ambition, the expanding portfolio of boats, the widening reputation, the gradual transformation of a ferry boy into something approaching a minor maritime magnate. The nickname, the Commodore, seemed to settle on him like a garment he had been destined to wear all along. By the early 1820s, as he approached 30 years of age, he had already remade the ferry business around Staten Island and the waters of New York Harbor according to his own vision of what it should be. The older regime of gentlemen's agreements and family monopolies had given way to something newer and more efficient, if perhaps less genteel. It was in the 1820s that Cornelius Vanderbilt began to sense the approaching end of an era, the age of wind and canvas, of sails catching the Atlantic breath, was giving way to something altogether new. The newspapers of the time carried extraordinary accounts of experimental vessels, machines that moved against the wind itself, powered by controlled fire and steam. What must he have felt watching these strange hybrid ships, part sail, part smoke, entering the harbor with their mechanical inevitability? The ferries that had made him prosperous were about to become relics. Around 1829, Vanderbilt made a decision that would transform not just his fortune, but the very character of American commerce. He purchased his first steamship, the Matilda Wheelock, a modest vessel by later standards, but revolutionary in her time. The transformation from ferry master to steamship operator was less a simple transition and more a venture into the entirely unknown. To captain a steamship in those early days was to navigate waters no one fully understood, waters thick with mechanical danger and the strange new language of steam pressure, boiler dynamics, and the unpredictable temperament of coal-fed furnaces. The technology itself, imagine trying to contain a controlled explosion within the wooden hull of a ship. The early steamships operated on principles that seem almost miraculous in retrospect. Water heated in massive iron boilers would transform into steam, that steam driving pistons back and forth with rhythmic inevitability, those pistons connected to paddle wheels that turned the vessel forward through the water, independent of wind and tide. The simple elegance of the mechanism belies the chaos lurking within. Coal smoke poured from tall stacks, creating a perpetual haze that made the steam-powered vessels visible from miles away, moving through fog banks like dark apparitions, their hulls vibrating with the rhythm of their own engines. But consider the peril inherent in such a system. Those boilers operated under tremendous pressure, and the metalworking techniques of the 1820s and 1830s were crude by modern standards. The slightest weakness in construction, the tiniest imperfection in riveting, could lead to catastrophic failure. Tales circulated throughout the maritime world of boiler explosions that killed crews instantly, that sent scalding steam through wooden corridors in horrifying fashion, that transformed efficient vessels into floating tombs. Many sailors faced a genuine choice between the old perils they understood, storm, reef, and drowning, and these new mechanical horrors they could not predict or control. Some preferred the wind. Others, perhaps sensing which way the future would turn, accepted the risk. Vanderbilt's entry into steamships coincided with fierce competition over established routes. The Hudson River, that crucial artery connecting New York to Albany, was already dominated by the monopoly held by Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton's company, the North River Steamboat Company, commonly known as the Fulton Monopoly. This legal protection granted them exclusive rights to operate steamships on New York waters, a stranglehold on commerce that seemed unassailable until Vanderbilt questioned its legitimacy. The legal battle that followed would eventually reach the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Marshall would rule in the case of Gibbons v. Ogden that interstate commerce belonged to Congress, not to states, effectively shattering the monopoly. But before that vindication, Vanderbilt had to operate in the shadows, running steamships on routes where legal ambiguity gave him room to maneuver. The experience of traveling by steamship in those early decades was something between marvel and ordeal. Passengers boarded vessels that were still primarily wooden, their hulls sealed against water seepage with oakum and tar, their cabins lit by oil lamps that swayed with the ship's motion and cast dancing shadows on mahogany walls. The air itself was transformed below decks, a mixture of coal smoke seeping through every crack, the metallic smell of steam and hot iron, the inevitable bilge water accumulating in the lowest parts of the hull despite constant pumping. Those who could afford it remained on deck, watching the shoreline pass with a speed that would have seemed impossible mere years before. A journey from New York to Albany, which might take days by sloop with uncertain winds, could now be completed in roughly 8 hours, a regularity and speed that merchants found intoxicating. Yet for the crew, those below-deck spaces represented a different reality entirely. The stokers and engineers who maintained the engines endured temperatures that could reach overwhelming intensity near the boilers. They worked in near darkness, guided only by the glow of the furnace doors, feeding coal constantly to maintain the precise steam pressure needed to keep the massive pistons moving. The noise was relentless. The hiss of steam, the mechanical clang and groan of iron on iron, the vibration that traveled through every timber of the ship. Men developed hearing loss, lung problems from coal dust, burn scars from inevitable splashes of scalding water or steam. The engineers in particular occupied a strange new professional class, part mechanic, part sailor, entirely essential and frequently undervalued by the captains who depended on their skill. Vanderbilt recognized something crucial that many of his competitors overlooked. Reliability and frequency mattered more than individual routes. If you could operate steamships regularly, predictably, safely, the market would come to you. This meant investing not just in vessels, but in the training and retention of reliable engineers. It meant maintaining boilers with obsessive care, replacing corroded sections before catastrophe struck, It meant paying wages that would attract competent crew rather than desperate drifters. This philosophy, that a well-maintained machine operated by competent hands would earn more than a cutting-corner operation running its equipment into the ground, became the foundation of his success in the steamship industry. By the mid-1830s, Vanderbilt had assembled a small fleet of steamships operating on various Hudson River routes and along the Atlantic coast. The sight of his vessels, their smokestacks rising above the water, their hulls painted in distinctive colors that his captains ensured were maintained immaculately, became increasingly familiar to those who traveled by water. The competition heated as other entrepreneurs saw the profits to be made. Races between steamships became common, spontaneous competitions that would later become legendary in maritime folklore. Captains would maintain pressure in boilers beyond safe limits, pushing their vessels to ever greater speeds. The Vanderbilt captains were known to be aggressive in these encounters, confident in the quality of their engineering and the reliability of their equipment. What drove this expansion, beyond mere profit-seeking? Perhaps there existed in Vanderbilt a temperament that saw stagnation as death. Having conquered the ferry trade, having accumulated respectable wealth through that enterprise, he might have been content to manage his existing holdings, gradually growing wealthier through careful husbandry of established lines. Instead, he invested heavily in new technology that was still unproven, that was still killing people, that required constant adaptation and learning. It suggests a mind that was fundamentally restless, that found satisfaction not in possession, but in the act of building, of competing, of expanding into spaces where others feared to venture. The steamship industry suited such a temperament perfectly. It was young, dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely fascinating to someone who could not bear to watch the world change without finding a way to control some portion of it. But as the Commodore's steam vessels multiplied across the waters and his reputation grew, something else began to crystallize in the commercial world, a reputation for methods that were not always gentle, not always confined to what we might call the boundaries of fair competition. The historical record shows us a man who understood that in the emerging age of industrial capitalism, sentiment had little place alongside ambition, and yet historians still debate, even now, the precise line between shrewd business strategy and something harder to defend. Picture, if you will, the Hudson River in the 1830s and 1840s. Established steamship operators had long held comfortable monopolies on certain routes. They charged what they wished. They maintained schedules as they saw fit, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt entered their domain. What he did was not, strictly speaking, illegal. Rather, he weaponized the one tool the older operators had never truly learned to fear: competition itself. When Vanderbilt wanted to break into a route controlled by rivals, he did not simply offer a marginally better service. He offered a devastating one. He would undercut fares so aggressively that passengers, drawn by prices almost absurdly low, abandoned the established lines in droves. This practice, which economists would later recognize as a deliberate strategy to force competitors into retreat, worked with remarkable efficiency. The older operators, their profits suddenly evaporating, faced a choice: fight or fold. Many folded. Some were bought out by Vanderbilt at prices that reflected their diminished value. A handful chose to fight, and what followed were the sorts of fierce, grinding commercial battles that left the Hudson changed. One such confrontation unfolded against the Livingston-Fulton interests, who had long held what they believed was an unassailable position. But Vanderbilt's persistent undercutting and his relentless acquisition of better, faster steamships gradually dismantled their dominion. Whether this constituted ruthlessness or merely the inevitable tide of progress remains, even in scholarly circles, a matter of interpretation. Some historians frame Vanderbilt as a disruptor who broke corrupt monopolies and brought genuine benefit to the traveling public through lower fares and better vessels. Others see in his methods a troubling precursor to the monopolistic practices that would later draw regulatory scrutiny and reform. The historical truth, as is often the case, seems to contain multitudes. A passenger in 1835 who could suddenly afford to travel by steamship where once they could not. Did they care about the finer points of Vanderbilt's competitive strategy? Likely not. They cared that the journey was now within reach. And yet, the captains and investors of those displaced steamship lines experienced Vanderbilt's rise as something closer to predation, a calculated dismantling of their livelihoods by a man with deeper pockets and fewer scruples about the use of them. What we know with certainty is this: Vanderbilt was willing to absorb losses in the short term that would bankrupt his competitors. He was willing to deploy his capital not merely to win customers but to make winning impossible for others. He seemed to understand intuitively that the question in a rapidly industrializing world was not whether you could compete, but whether you could compete until others could not. It is a distinction that matters, and one that his contemporaries felt acutely. There were other tactics too, less visible, but no less consequential. Vanderbilt was known to have struck deals, sometimes explicit, sometimes merely understood, with politicians and port officials who could make life difficult for his rivals. A convenient regulation, a dock dispute resolved in his favor, access to the most valuable berths, while competitors were relegated to the margins. These arrangements were not unusual in the 19th century, when the boundary between private enterprise and public governance remained far more porous than we might expect. Yet they reveal something about how Vanderbilt operated. He was not content to compete solely on the merits of his vessels or the quality of his service. He worked every angle, pulled every lever, called in every favor. Some of his contemporaries began to whisper about ruthlessness, and the word took root. It followed him through the decades, coloring how people spoke of his name even as they acknowledged his achievements. But here is where the historical record grows more complicated still, and where we must linger a moment before moving forward. Not everyone saw Vanderbilt as a villain of capitalism's early days. Shipping customers benefited enormously from the competition he forced into being. Fares that had been fixed at monopolistic levels came tumbling down. Service improved, routes expanded. The infrastructure of American water commerce was transformed from a sluggish, oligopolistic arrangement into something far more dynamic and responsive to public demand. A few historians have even made the argument, and it is an argument worth holding lightly, like a question rather than a certainty, that Vanderbilt's aggressive methods, however discomforting they may seem through a modern lens, did more to democratize travel in America than a gentler, less competitive approach ever could have done. The wealthy had always been able to travel comfortably. It was the Commodore's willingness to fight, to cut prices, to expand capacity relentlessly, that eventually made steam travel possible for ordinary people. Whether that justifies the methods is a question each person must answer for themselves as they encounter his story. What remains undeniable is that by the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated not merely a fleet of steamships, but a kind of power that extended far beyond the purely commercial realm. He had become a figure that people reacted to, some with admiration, others with a wariness tinged with something approaching fear. His name appeared in newspapers not just as a businessman, but as a force of nature, something that moved through the established order and left it irretrievably altered. The question of whether he had done this fairly or ruthlessly, whether his methods were justified or excessive, had begun to take on a life of its own in the public imagination, and it would continue to echo through historical judgment for generations to come. By the middle of the 19th century, something profound was shifting beneath the surface of American commerce, though few could have predicted how completely it would transform the nation. The steamship fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt had so carefully accumulated, the respect, the capital, the intricate knowledge of maritime transport, was about to become, in a sense, almost quaint. The iron horse was coming. The railroads were spreading across the continent like a vast nervous system, and a man with Vanderbilt's instincts for power and expansion could scarcely ignore what was unfolding. The story of how he came to railroads was not one of sudden revelation, but rather of gradual awakening. He was already in his 50s when the pivotal moment arrived, a man accustomed to dominance, watching younger competitors and older established railroad men begin to sense the enormous wealth that lay ahead. What drew him in, really, was something almost mathematical, the realization that railroads would dwarf shipping, that they would move not just goods and people, but the very sinews of the nation's growing economy. He had built his fortune by understanding the economics of movement. Rails simply moved things faster, more reliably, over longer distances. Why would a man like him not want to master this new realm? Picture, if you will, the American landscape of the 1850s and 1860s. Imagine the sound before you see it, a distant, rhythmic thunder that would grow louder as the years progressed. Smoke rising in dark plumes above the horizon, not the thin grey wisps of steamship smokestacks, but thick columns that hung in the air, rolling and billowing against the sky. The smell of burning coal, acrid and powerful, mingling with the metallic scent of heated iron. As locomotives gathered speed, their wheels grinding against rails that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the future, they carried with them the promise of a transformed America. The very technology of the railroad was almost incomprehensibly wondrous to those living through its expansion. These were not delicate machines. They were brutal, practical, powerful things. Boilers generating immense heat and pressure, enormous driving wheels that could pull loads that would have required armies of horses and oxen. The sound alone was revolutionary. That rhythmic, hammering clatter of wheels on rail joints, the sharp hiss of steam, the mighty chugging that became almost musical once you grew accustomed to it. Families living near railroad lines learned to set their clocks by the passing of particular trains. The earth itself seemed to tremble as these mechanical giants thundered past. And the tracks themselves, how they reshaped the very face of America. These ribbons of iron and wood ties seemed to appear almost overnight, cutting through forests that had stood for centuries, bridging valleys, scaling mountains. Railroad construction became one of the great human endeavors of the era, a massive undertaking that required not just capital, but vision. Someone had to decide where the rails would go, which valleys they would follow, which communities they would serve, and which they would leave behind. In this way, the railroad magnates became, in effect, architects of the nation's geography. They drew lines on maps, and those lines became iron reality, directing the flow of commerce and population for generations to come. Vanderbilt, by the late 1850s, had begun to position himself in this new world. His initial ventures into railroads were relatively modest compared to what would come later, but they bore his fingerprints nonetheless. He had that particular talent, you understand, for seeing value where others saw complexity or risk. While many established businessmen remained committed to the shipping interests that had made them wealthy, Vanderbilt was already shifting his gaze westward, toward the expanding network of rails that would eventually connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. The transition was not instantaneous. It is often the case in history that the great turning points appear gradual to those living through them, only seeming sudden in retrospect. For years, Vanderbilt maintained his shipping interests while slowly, almost methodically, acquiring railroad stock and taking positions on various railroad boards. He was testing the waters, learning the business from the inside, understanding the particular challenges and opportunities that differentiated railroads from steamships. The principles of ruthless competition that had served him so well in maritime commerce would serve him equally well in the railroad world, though the landscape and the players were different. What one must understand about this period is the sheer chaos of American railroads in their early decades. There was no unified system. Hundreds of small railroad companies operated independently, often with tracks of different gauges, different widths, that prevented trains from one line connecting smoothly to another. This fragmentation made the systems inefficient, but it also created opportunities for someone with capital, intelligence, and absolutely no qualms about aggressive business practices to consolidate, to create order, to build something larger and more powerful than anything that had existed before. The landscape was changing in visible ways. In New York and the surrounding regions, where Vanderbilt's interests naturally gravitated, you could see the transformation unfolding across the years. Where there had been small towns and agricultural land, suddenly there was rail infrastructure. Stations rose up, some grand, some modest, but all of them representing a new kind of center for American life. The railroad station became a gathering place, a symbol of connection to the wider world. Smoke from passing trains drifted across farmland. The sound of construction, hammering, the grinding of metal on metal, became familiar to people living along proposed routes. By the 1860s, as the nation was tearing itself apart in civil war, Vanderbilt was quietly accumulating power in the railroad sector. The war itself, paradoxically, accelerated railroad development and demonstrated their strategic importance. Trains moved troops, they carried supplies. They demonstrated to the nation what railroads truly meant in terms of power and control. When the war ended and the nation turned its attention back to commerce and expansion, the railroads became the obvious vehicle for that expansion, and Vanderbilt was positioned, by then, to be among those steering the direction of American rails. The narrative of the railroad era, and of Vanderbilt's role in it, often focuses on the grand business maneuvers, the consolidations and the stock battles. But there is something else worth contemplating as well. These were machines and systems that were genuinely reshaping how Americans lived, worked, and thought about distance and possibility. The railroad made the nation feel smaller, more connected. It enabled a mobility that would have seemed fantastic to previous generations. And yet, this transformation was being orchestrated by men who were rarely thinking about anything beyond profit and power. There is something almost dreamlike about that contradiction, the way great historical forces move forward, driven by individual ambition and greed, creating effects and consequences far larger than any single person intended. By the middle decades of the 19th century, Cornelius Vanderbilt had begun to recognize something that many of his competitors had not yet fully grasped. The future of American commerce and mobility belonged not to the steamship, but to the iron rail. The very technology that had seemed impossibly daunting just years before was now becoming the sinew and skeleton of a nation stretching westward with almost feverish ambition. The Commodore, now entering the latter chapters of his middle years, possessed both the capital and the ruthlessness necessary to consolidate what had been a fragmented, chaotic landscape of competing railroad interests into something far more organized, far more profitable, and far more his own. Picture, if you will, the New York Central Railroad as it existed in those years before Vanderbilt's full control, a patchwork of independent companies, some prospering, others struggling under the weight of inefficiency and obsolete infrastructure. The tracks themselves were scattered across the state like the scattered threads of a tapestry that had never quite been woven together with intention. Various operators ran their own sections, their own stations, their own schedules, with little regard for anything resembling coordination or standardization. It was, in many ways, a system designed to be inefficient, designed to lose money, designed to frustrate any passenger or merchant who dared attempt to move goods or themselves across the state with anything resembling reliability. And yet, it was precisely this chaos that presented the keenest opportunity to a man of Vanderbilt's vision and determination. The Commodore had already begun purchasing stock in the Central in the 1850s, accumulating shares with patient, methodical precision through intermediaries and trusted associates. He never announced his intentions loudly or displayed his hand too eagerly. Instead, he bought and waited, all the while studying the operations, identifying the weak points, mapping the terrain of inefficiency and waste. By the 1860s, he had become the largest shareholder, though the formal presidency still eluded him, held by men who did not fully comprehend that their own era was already drawing to a close. When he finally assumed full control, a moment of transition that seemed almost inevitably quiet, as if the railroad itself had simply been waiting for its true master to finally step forward and claim what had always been his by right of superior will and capital. Vanderbilt set about the work of consolidation with a clarity of purpose that distinguished him from lesser men. He did not simply reorganize, he reimagined. He did not merely manage, he transformed. The separate companies that made up the Central's network were absorbed, merged, their redundancies eliminated, their operations consolidated into a single, unified system under his absolute control. And what emerged from this process was something genuinely revolutionary in its efficiency. The schedules became consistent. The stations began to coordinate with one another. The locomotives that had seemed so new and miraculous just decades before were now organized into rational systems of maintenance, operation, and deployment. The tracks themselves were upgraded, standardized to uniform gauges, allowing cars to move seamlessly from one section of line to another without the tedious transfers that had once been necessary. It was as if Vanderbilt had imposed order upon chaos simply by the force of his will and the clarity of his vision. Listen, if you can imagine it, to the sound of a locomotive in motion during those years of consolidation and transformation, not the frantic, irregular rhythms of competing lines operating at cross purposes, but rather a steady, measured pulse, a deep, rolling hum that seems almost mechanical in its consistency, almost meditative in its predictability. The great pistons moving back and forth with mechanical precision, the wheels turning against the rail with that distinctive periodic metallic whisper, the whole great machine breathing, in a sense, with a rhythm that becomes almost hypnotic to those who hear it regularly, who work within its sphere, who come to understand that they are part of something larger than themselves, something organized, unified, moving with purpose toward distant destinations. The locomotives themselves during this era were remarkable machines by the standards of the time, though we might regard them as primitive by our modern sensibilities. They belched black smoke into the air, thick and choking plumes that rose from their smokestacks and drifted across the landscape. The engines were named, as was the custom, often bearing the names of states, or heroes, or classical figures, and each possessed its own particular character, its own temperament, its own individual quirks. Some ran hot and fast, their crews coaxing every ounce of power from the boiler. Others ran steadier, more reliable, preferred by those engineers who valued consistency over dramatic performance. What Vanderbilt understood, and what set him apart from many of his contemporaries, was that the railroad business was not ultimately about the romantic aspects of speed and distance, however captivating those elements might be to the imagination. It was about throughput. It was about moving the maximum amount of cargo and passengers with the minimum expenditure of resources over the greatest possible distance. It was about numbers and calculations and the relentless pursuit of marginal efficiencies that, when multiplied across thousands of miles of track and millions of transactions, amounted to enormous accumulations of wealth. The New York Central, under his consolidated control, became a model of operational efficiency. The feeder lines that brought freight and passengers into the main trunk were rationalized. The terminal facilities were upgraded. The passenger cars themselves were improved, made more comfortable, more reliable, and gradually, inexorably, the profits began to flow, not merely trickling into the company's coffers, but pouring in with an almost overwhelming abundance. The Commodore had taken a good thing, a functioning but disorganized railroad, and transformed it into a great thing, a machine for generating wealth that seemed almost unstoppable in its relentless operation. Consider the sensory atmosphere of a major railroad terminal during this period of consolidation and growth. The constant sound of locomotives, that deep mechanical breathing we spoke of, formed a kind of background hum that passengers came to accept, almost without conscious awareness. The smell of coal smoke, sharp and acrid, mingled with the smell of hot metal, of steam condensing, of wooden ties and ballast stone. The visual chaos of movement, porters carrying luggage, passengers hurrying to catch departures, workers maintaining the endless machinery that kept everything running, and through it all, the regular pulse of the locomotives coming and going, the timetables posted in neat rows, everything organized, everything accounted for, everything part of a unified whole. The consolidation of the New York Central was not, it should be noted, accomplished without resistance and without occasional controversy. There were competitors whose interests were threatened, established operators who found themselves displaced or subordinated to the Commodore's organizational schemes. There were stockholders who questioned his methods, who worried about the concentration of power in a single man's hands, who wondered whether the pursuit of efficiency might come at too high a cost to other values and considerations. Historians continue to debate, even now, whether Vanderbilt's tactics in this period crossed certain lines, whether his elimination of competition and his consolidation of power represented legitimate business practice or something more sinister and self-serving. These questions remain contested ground, matters of perspective and interpretation rather than simple fact. Yet what cannot be disputed is that the result was effective. By the late 1860s and into the 1870s, the New York Central Railroad operated as a unified system that was the envy of the railroad world. Its efficiency translated directly into profitability. Its profitability was reflected in rising dividends for shareholders and in the accumulating personal wealth of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who owned the largest share and reaped the largest rewards. And its efficiency also translated, one might argue, into improved service for passengers and shippers, into faster transit times and more reliable schedules than had existed before. The hum of those locomotives, the steady breathing of the railroad in motion, became almost a soundtrack to American life during this era. Millions of people traveled on the New York Central's trains. Countless millions of tons of cargo moved along its tracks, and all of it was part of a single, unified, coherent system. That system bore the imprint of one man's will, one man's vision, one man's ruthless determination to organize the world according to his own understanding of what was possible and what was necessary. By the 1860s and 70s, the railroads that Cornelius Vanderbilt had gathered into his vast network were transforming not merely the geography of America, but the very fabric of how millions of people moved through their days. Yet all those hundreds of miles of iron track, all those locomotives breathing smoke into the sky, all those passengers arriving and departing, they needed a center, a place where the lines converged, a great gathering point that would stand as a monument to the age of rail itself. And so, in the heart of Manhattan, on a stretch of land that had once been less prestigious, less coveted, Vanderbilt and his engineers began to conceive of something entirely new, the Grand Central Depot. Picture, if you will, the site as it existed in those years before construction began. It was the location of an older, far more modest passenger station, one that had served its purpose adequately, but was rapidly becoming too small, too chaotic, too insufficient for the flood of humanity that the railroads were delivering to New York City each day. The Vanderbilt lines alone were bringing thousands upon thousands of passengers into Manhattan, businessmen with leather cases, families seeking opportunity, Immigrants stepping onto American soil for the first time. The old station could scarcely contain them. They spilled onto the streets. Confusion reigned. Something grander, something more orderly, something that spoke of permanence and vision was required. The vision that emerged was extraordinary. The original Grand Central Depot, which began to take shape in the early 1870s, was designed to be more than a mere functional railway terminal. It was conceived as a palace of transit, a cathedral of movement, a space that would reflect the power and ambition of the Vanderbilt enterprise itself. The building rose with a kind of stately magnificence that was meant to announce to anyone who stepped inside that they were entering something important, something dignified, something that belonged to the great age of American industry and progress. Walk through those doors, had you been there, in the years following its completion in 1871, and you would have encountered a space unlike anything most travelers had experienced before. The main hall was vast and echoing, its ceiling soaring far overhead, supported by iron columns that seemed to reach upward like the masts of ships. There was something almost oceanic about it, though these were ships of rail, not water. The light, in those years, came largely from great windows, but also from gas lamps, hundreds of them, their flames casting a warm, dancing glow across the marble and stone. In the morning, when sunlight streamed through the windows, the interior seemed almost luminous. In the evening, when the gas lamps were lit, the space took on an entirely different character, more intimate somehow, more mysterious, the shadows gathering in the corners and upper reaches of the hall. And the atmosphere, the sensory experience of being inside Grand Central in those early decades, was unlike anything that exists in our modern world. There was steam. Everywhere there was steam. From the locomotives themselves, from the pipes and heating systems, from the breath of tens of thousands of people passing through each day. The steam rose and curled and dissipated, creating layers of atmosphere, quite literally. It mingled with the smell of coal smoke that had seeped into the very fabric of the building, a smell that must have been almost intoxicating to those who worked there daily, who breathed it in from morning until night. There was the sharp metallic odor of iron and steel, the industrial scent of oil and grease, the faint chemical smell of gas lamps burning. All of these layered together created an olfactory landscape that was entirely of its time, entirely of the railroad age. The sounds were equally immersive and, in their own way, quite soothing in the manner of white noise and environmental rhythm. The rumble of trains arriving and departing, even when muffled by distance, was a constant presence. The hiss of steam from the locomotives provided a kind of underlying susurration, a white noise that filled the space. There was the percussion of footsteps on marble and stone, hundreds and thousands of them throughout the day, creating a kind of ambient music of human movement. There were the calls of porters, the clicking of baggage carts, the clanging of bells announcing departures and arrivals. It was cacophonous, certainly, and yet many who worked within those walls seemed to find in it a strange sort of rhythm, a pattern that became comforting through familiarity. The lighting, which we mentioned before, deserves its own meditation. The architects and engineers who designed Grand Central had to solve a problem that was genuinely novel. How do you illuminate a vast interior space lit primarily by gas lamps before the widespread use of electric lighting? The answer was to create a system of lanterns, many of them positioned throughout the space, to catch and reflect light in such a way that no corner was left in complete darkness, and yet no area was harshly or artificially bright. The shadows created by this system of lighting were considerable and gave the space a kind of theatrical quality. When you walked through Grand Central in the 1870s and 80s, you were walking through a space that shifted its appearance as you moved, as the angle of the light changed, as the crowds parted and reformed around you. Early photographers who captured images of the interior would note that the quality of light seemed almost ethereal, almost dreamlike in its quality. The purpose of Grand Central, beyond the obvious practical function of moving people from trains to the streets and vice versa, was also to serve as a statement, a declaration. When you stepped into that depot, whether you were arriving in the city or departing from it, you were meant to understand that you were participating in something grand, something modern, something that represented the very pinnacle of American achievement and ambition. The Vanderbilt name, though not inscribed in vast letters above the doors, was present nonetheless in every detail of the architecture, in every choice about how the space was designed and maintained. This was a Vanderbilt enterprise, built by Vanderbilt capital, shaped by Vanderbilt vision. It announced that vision to the world every single day. There is something poignant, perhaps, in contemplating a space like this, so monumental, so permanent seeming, so carefully crafted to project an image of timeless power, and remembering that nothing in human civilization is ever truly permanent. The original Grand Central Depot would eventually be replaced, expanded, rebuilt. The very space that seemed so grand, so architecturally advanced, would one day be seen as insufficiently large, insufficiently modern. The world moves forward, the wheels turn. The locomotives that once seemed like the ultimate expression of technological mastery would one day seem quaint, historical, relegated to museums and heritage railways. But in its moment, in those decades when it stood as the great portal to New York City, the Grand Central Depot was the physical manifestation of the Vanderbilt Empire at its height, a space where wealth, technology, vision, and human aspiration all converged in those foggy mornings and gaslit evenings, in the steam and the sound, in the great flux of people moving through their lives. And yet, beneath the polished brass of the Commodore's ambitions, beneath the relentless forward momentum of locomotives and iron rail, there existed another world entirely, one that rarely appeared in the ledgers or the society pages, but which was no less essential to the story of what the Vanderbilts built. For every fortune consolidated, for every mile of track laid down and secured under one family's control, there were hands, countless hands, calloused and perpetually tired hands, belonging to men whose names would never appear in history books, whose daily struggles formed the actual sinew and bone of the empire itself. Consider, if you will, what it actually meant to build a railroad in the 1800s. Not the boardroom decision to build one. That was Vanderbilt's realm, strategy, and capital, and the manipulation of financial markets. But the physical work, the clearing of forests and the blasting of rock faces, and the laying of sleepers one after another across terrain that had never known iron before. The work began before dawn most days, and it began in whatever weather the season offered. Rain would turn the construction sites into landscapes of mud and sliding earth. Winter brought cold so severe that men's fingers would lose sensation hours before they lost the ability to grip a shovel. Summer heat rose from the exposed ground in waves that made the air itself seem solid, and men would drink water from buckets that sat in the sun, water that had become almost too warm to be refreshing. The workers on Vanderbilt's expanding lines came from everywhere and from nowhere in particular. They came from rural America because the farms were consolidating, because smaller landholders were being forced off their property by economic forces larger than themselves. They came from Ireland in extraordinary numbers, fleeing the Great Famine of the 1840s and 1850s, arriving at American ports with almost nothing, and taking whatever work would allow them to survive. They came from Germany, from Italy, from Eastern Europe as the century wore on, each wave of immigration timing itself to the next great expansion of rail. They came as young men, many of them, or as men who had been made old by previous hardships, and they came with the understanding that this work, dangerous as it was, represented their only path towards something resembling stability. What did a railroad laborer's day actually look like? It began before light, often with a walk from a camp or a rented room to the site, sometimes a walk of several miles. The foreman would assign work by crew, and the crews would be organized by ethnicity more often than not, a deliberate choice by the railroad companies to discourage solidarity and minimize the likelihood of organized resistance to working conditions. Irishmen in one section, Italians in another, Germans elsewhere. The logic was simple and coldly efficient. If the workers could not communicate easily with one another, they could not organize. If they could not organize, they could not strike or demand higher wages or refuse dangerous tasks. The work itself was methodical in its repetition and brutal in its physical demand. Men would swing picks into stone for hours at a time, the vibration traveling up through their arms and into their shoulders, creating a dull ache that by day's end had become the most natural sensation in their bodies. Teams would maneuver heavy wooden ties and rails into position, using only the leverage of their own strength and the basic physics of levers and pulleys. The weight of a single rail could be enormous, and a man caught beneath one would not often survive. Explosives were used to blast through rock formations, black powder, and later dynamite, handled by men with minimal training and almost no protective equipment. The number of workers killed or permanently injured in these explosions was never precisely tallied, but it was certainly significant, and the remains of those accidents were simply removed from the site and the work continued. Pay was minimal by today's standards, even accounting for the century's different economy. A laborer might earn $1 or $1.50 per day, which seems trivial until you consider that this was genuine wealth to someone arriving from another country with nothing. But the deductions were immediate and relentless. Deductions for housing in company camps, deductions for food purchased at company stores where prices were deliberately inflated, deductions for tools and equipment. By the end of a pay period, a worker might find that he had earned very little that he could actually keep. The company stores were particularly notorious, a form of debt servitude wrapped in the language of convenience. You could buy goods on credit and pay when you were paid, but the prices were so inflated and the system so designed to ensure that workers remained perpetually indebted that many men found themselves locked into a cycle they could never escape. Housing for these workers was primitive. In the early days, men simply camped wherever they were working, in canvas tents or crude wooden structures they built themselves. As the century progressed, companies sometimes constructed more permanent camps, but these were invariably squalid. Multiple men crowded into small rooms or bunkhouses, sharing bedding, often lacking adequate ventilation. Disease spread easily through these camps: cholera, typhoid, influenza. Sanitation was an afterthought if it was considered at all. There are records from various railroad constructions throughout this era describing camps where more men died of disease and accident than were killed in any single catastrophic event. And yet the work continued, because there were always more men arriving, always more desperate men willing to risk their lives for that $1 or $1.50 per day. Yet something curious happened in the lived experience of these workers, something that the historical record often glosses over in its focus on the titans of industry. There developed, among many of these laborers, a genuine sense of accomplishment. Not pride in serving the Vanderbilt Empire, how could there be, but pride in the work itself, in the knowledge that they had moved something immense into existence through their own effort and skill. Men would talk about the section they had built, the mountain they had helped tunnel through, the bridge they had helped raise. They had participated in reshaping the continent, and that knowledge, despite its context of exploitation and hardship, carried a weight that sustained some of them through the difficult years. The relationship between the workers and the railroad companies was fundamentally asymmetrical. The companies held all the power. They could cut wages with a day's notice. They could fire a man for any reason, or for no reason, leaving him stranded far from home with no means of returning. They could ignore injuries and simply hire replacement workers from the endless stream of desperate men. And yet, cyclically, periods of resistance emerged. There were strikes, sometimes successful, more often brutally suppressed. There were work slowdowns and subtle forms of sabotage, tools mysteriously breaking at crucial moments, work somehow proceeding more slowly than it might have. The companies hired private security and sometimes called upon state militia to break strikes, and there are grim episodes scattered throughout railroad history where workers were killed by the very authority structures that were supposed to protect them. Who were these men that built Vanderbilt's railroads? In one sense, they were invisible. In another sense, they were the entire foundation upon which the empire rested. A young Irishman named Michael, perhaps, who arrived at Boston Harbor in 1850 with nothing but the clothes he wore, who spent the next 15 years following railroad construction projects, and who died at 42 of injuries sustained in a blasting accident that left him unable to work. A German immigrant named Johann, who learned the trade of railcar maintenance and who eventually rose to become a foreman, who never became wealthy, but who eventually brought his family over from the old country, and who could point to specific sections of track and say, "I built that." An Italian laborer named Giuseppe who worked on 3 different major railroad projects, who saved his money, who eventually purchased a small piece of land, and who founded a modest construction company that employed other Italian immigrants, creating a different kind of empire on a much smaller scale. These stories exist primarily in fragments. We know they happened because we know the railroads were built, and railroads cannot build themselves. We know the workers existed because we can find occasional references in company records or in letters and diaries, but the vast majority of these men left no formal trace. Their accomplishments were literally embedded in the landscape, the grades they cut, the tunnels they blasted, the bridges they raised, yet their names and their individual struggles have mostly dissolved into the past. It is worth pausing here, in the midst of this narrative of empire and wealth and the consolidation of power, to acknowledge the invisible workers who made it all possible, not out of guilt, necessarily, though that has its place, but out of simple historical accuracy. The Vanderbilt fortune did not emerge purely from the genius of one man's business acumen. It emerged because a family had the capital and the willingness to invest it in enormous projects, yes, but also because thousands of men, most of them poor, most of them vulnerable, most of them desperate, provided the actual labor that transformed vision into reality. The Commodore could not have been the Commodore without them. William Henry Vanderbilt could not have doubled the fortune without them. The Fifth Avenue mansions and the Newport estates and the railroad network itself would not have existed without the hands that built them, day after day, in heat and cold, in danger and hardship, for wages that barely sustained life. And so the Vanderbilt story, as it continues forward, becomes more complex. It is not simply a tale of one family's rise and refinement and eventual decline. It is a tale of 2 worlds that intersected, the world of privilege and the world of labor, moving in opposite directions, one toward ever greater comfort and security and elegance, the other toward increasing struggles for dignity and fair compensation in a system fundamentally stacked against them. Both worlds were real. Both worlds shaped what America became. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt reached his 70s, the restless energy that had driven him across countless waterways and into every corner of American commerce had begun, perhaps inevitably, to slow. Not to stillness, that was never his nature, but to something more measured, more reflective, as the weight of his accumulated decades pressed gently against even his formidable frame. The man who had once leaped from boat to boat, who had squared his shoulders against every competitor, who had built his fortune through sheer force of will and cunning negotiation, now sat in the quieter chambers of his own vast empire, watching it continue to turn without requiring his constant hand upon the wheel. His wealth by this time had become almost abstract in its enormity. To speak of millions feels insufficient, for the scale had grown beyond what most people could hold in their minds. He had transformed the New York Central Railroad into a network that stretched across hundreds of miles, binding the country together with iron rails and the hum of locomotives. His personal fortune had swelled to somewhere between $100 and $200 million. Historians debate the exact figure, as the measurement of such vast sums in the 19th century remained imprecise. But what mattered more than any number was what it represented: the single largest fortune accumulated by any individual in American history to that point. It had taken him nearly 80 years to build, year by patient, often ruthless year. In his final years, Vanderbilt's life had taken on a different texture. He had remarried in his later 60s to a woman named Frank Armstrong Crawford, a woman considerably younger than himself, and their household maintained something of the grandeur that befitted his station, though there was perhaps less of the fever-pitch ambition that had characterized his middle years. He had already begun to think, in that careful way that very old men do, about what would become of it all, about who would inherit not just the money, but the responsibility, the power, the understanding of how to maintain an empire that had taken the whole of a lifetime to construct. His eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, had proven himself capable in the ways his father demanded. William Henry had shown a keen mind for business, a steady hand, and the kind of shrewd judgment that did not come from studying ledgers alone, but from watching, listening, learning from the man who had built the foundation upon which everything stood. The relationship between father and son had not always been easy. Cornelius was exacting, demanding, prone to irritability when he perceived weakness or incompetence, but there existed between them a fundamental respect, born of mutual recognition of what it took to navigate the world of high finance and transportation. In 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt drafted his will, the landscape of his intentions became clear. The bulk of his estate, approximately 95% of everything he possessed, would pass to William Henry. This was not an act of whimsy or casual generosity. It was strategy. Cornelius understood that to fracture a fortune among too many heirs was to ensure its gradual dissolution. He had seen it happen to other great fortunes, watched as the next generation squabbled and divided, and allowed what had been built with such singular purpose to crumble into smaller, weaker pieces. So he chose concentration: one son, one inheritor capable of understanding the weight of what he was leaving behind. To his other children, he left substantial sums, millions of dollars each, sums that would have rendered almost any other person of the era wealthy beyond reasonable measure, but nothing compared to what William Henry received. His daughters received their portions, his younger sons received theirs, but they all understood, in that unspoken way that families do, that William Henry was the chosen vessel for the Vanderbilt legacy. He was the one upon whom the full weight of the empire would rest. On January 4, 1877, as winter held tight to New York, and the city moved through its routines, unaware that a fundamental shift in the geography of American wealth was occurring, Cornelius Vanderbilt died. He was 82 years old. The man who had arrived on Staten Island as a ferry boy in the early years of the 19th century, who had fought his way through rivals and skeptics, who had built and rebuilt his fortune multiple times over, who had seen the entire face of transportation and commerce transform under his influence, had finally reached the end of his long and extraordinarily consequential life. The newspapers, of course, were filled with eulogies and accounts of his passing. They remarked upon his influence, his cunning, the way he had accumulated more wealth than perhaps any man before him. Some praised him as a visionary who had understood the future of American commerce before anyone else. Others were less charitable, noting his ruthlessness, his willingness to destroy competitors without mercy, his aggressive pursuit of monopoly. The truth, as is so often the case, contained elements of both. He had been brilliant and brutal, visionary and calculating, a man whose ambitions had reshaped the landscape of an entire nation. What remained after his death was not just the tangible empire of railroads and real estate, of stocks and bonds and properties spread across the country, but also the question that would echo through the next generation: could anyone maintain what he had built? Could his chosen heir, William Henry, not merely possess the fortune, but understand it, preserve it, perhaps even expand it? In the days following the funeral, the will was read to the family assembled in the hushed formal rooms of the Vanderbilt household. William Henry listened as the magnitude of his inheritance was laid bare in legal language and precise figures. He was now, at a stroke, one of the wealthiest men in the world. The railroads that his father had spent decades accumulating were now his to manage. The stocks, the properties, the real estate, all of it flowed to him like a great river, suddenly redirected into a new channel. But inheritance, even of unimaginable wealth, is a peculiar kind of burden. It is not the same as building. It is not the same as creating something from nothing, as Cornelius had done. It is instead the weight of maintaining, of preserving, of ensuring that what was handed to you does not slip away in the subsequent decades. William Henry understood this. He had watched his father at work for his entire life. He had absorbed lessons that could never be fully articulated in words, lessons that lived instead in the rhythm of decision-making, in the instinct for where opportunity lay, in the willingness to make hard choices when sentiment might argue otherwise. The Vanderbilt fortune did not rest with Cornelius's death. It did not become static or fixed. Instead, it passed into new hands, hands that had their own ambitions, their own vision for what could be done with such accumulated power. And in that transition, there lay the seeds of what would come next, the Gilded Age in full flourish, the building of mansions that seemed to defy imagination, the transformation of the Vanderbilt name from that of a single man into that of an entire dynasty. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, at the extraordinary age of 82, having accumulated a fortune estimated between $105 million, a sum almost impossible to grasp in those days, representing perhaps the single largest personal wealth any American had yet assembled, many observers wondered what would become of his empire. The newspapers, the society journals, the rival industrialists, all leaned forward with a kind of quiet hunger, as if waiting to see whether his sons would squander this vast inheritance or somehow preserve it. Yet within the walls of the Vanderbilt mansion, a far different story was already unfolding. William Henry Vanderbilt, the second son, had inherited the bulk of his father's railroad interests and the moral authority that came with the family name. Unlike his father, who had spent his later years cultivating a public persona of almost theatrical grandeur, traveling through Europe in great style, purchasing art, making grand pronouncements about American business, William Henry chose a different path entirely. He was a quieter man, less given to bold declarations, more inclined toward methodical, almost mechanical expansion of what his father had built. One might imagine that such a transition would have weakened the Vanderbilt position. The Commodore's successor seemed, to many observers, almost lacking in the aggressive fire that had characterized his father's rise. Where Cornelius had been imperious, William Henry appeared almost modest. Where the Commodore had enjoyed the spotlight, William Henry seemed to prefer the counting house. And yet, within a span of just 8 years, 8 remarkable years, William Henry would not merely preserve his father's fortune, he would double it. How does a man double $100 million in less than a decade? The answer lies in understanding that William Henry possessed something perhaps even more valuable than his father's ferocious personality. He possessed discipline. He possessed a kind of patient, systematic intelligence that saw opportunity not in grand gestures, but in careful, incremental consolidation. Where his father had pioneered the railroad empire, building it through daring and sometimes questionable tactics, William Henry refined it. He standardized it. He made it predictable and, paradoxically, more profitable. The New York Central Railroad, which had been the crown jewel of Cornelius Vanderbilt's holdings, became under William Henry something almost like a money-printing machine. He improved efficiency on the lines. He negotiated more favorable terms with suppliers. He pruned away inefficiencies that had crept into his father's empire, for even the Commodore, for all his genius, had left certain redundancies, certain wastefulness, born of rapid expansion and constant acquisition. William Henry saw these gaps and closed them, one by one, with the methodical care of a clockmaker adjusting a timepiece. Perhaps most significantly, William Henry understood that the railroad business of the 1880s was fundamentally different from the railroad business of the 1850s and 60s. The era of daring competition and cutthroat rivalry was giving way to something new, a more mature industrial landscape where power consolidated not through individual courage or aggressive tactics, but through the careful management of existing assets, through alliances and understandings between the great railroad barons. Where the Commodore had fought with rivals and sometimes crushed them, William Henry negotiated with them. Where his father saw enemies, William Henry saw potential partners. It would be a simplification to suggest that William Henry was merely passive or conservative. There is ample evidence that he was a shrewd businessman, perhaps even a brilliant one, just in a different register than his father. But his genius lay in what we might call maintenance, in the preservation and deepening of power rather than its initial conquest. The Commodore had been a revolutionary figure in American business. His son was a consolidator, a perfecter of systems. What made this period particularly fascinating from the standpoint of wealth accumulation was that William Henry was operating within a national economy that was itself booming. The 1880s and early 1890s saw tremendous growth in American industrial output, in railroad miles laid, in goods moved across the continent. To be the Vanderbilt, to control the New York Central Railroad and its affiliated lines, was to be positioned at the absolute center of this expansion. Every dollar of national growth seemed to flow through the Vanderbilt system, and William Henry had the wisdom to capture as much of it as possible. The wealth figures are almost abstract in their magnitude. The New York Central, under his stewardship, generated revenues that seemed almost impossible. Dividends flowed steadily to the Vanderbilt family coffers. Stock values climbed. Investments in other ventures yielded consistent returns. And remarkably, William Henry appeared entirely comfortable with this process, even serene about it. Unlike his father, who had seemed almost hungry for wealth even as he accumulated more than any man could spend, William Henry seemed merely to accept it as the natural outcome of good management. This distinction between father and son speaks to something quite profound about the nature of wealth and ambition. Cornelius Vanderbilt had been driven by a kind of insatiable hunger for victory, for dominance, for the knowledge that his will could shape the world around him. Wealth was important to him, certainly, but it was almost secondary to the satisfaction of conquest, of winning. William Henry, by contrast, seemed to view wealth more as an abstract measure of power and influence. He took pleasure in the structure of things, in organization, in the satisfaction of a well-managed enterprise. This does not mean that William Henry was indifferent to grandeur or display. The Vanderbilt family's social prominence did not diminish under his stewardship. Indeed, it grew. But William Henry's approach to that grandeur was characteristically different from his father's. Where the Commodore had sought to shock and astonish, to remind people of his power through visible expenditure, William Henry seemed content to allow his wealth to speak for itself, to manifest in the steady accumulation of estates and art collections and social influence. The irony, of course, is that this quieter, less flamboyant approach to wealth management proved far more effective at preserving and expanding the family fortune than his father's more theatrical methods ever could have been. In simply managing what he had been given, in making it more efficient and more productive, William Henry was performing a kind of alchemy that would have astonished his father, not through daring, not through audacity, but through something almost ordinary, through patience and method, and the careful study of how things actually worked. By 1885, when William Henry himself began to contemplate the inevitable questions of succession, wondering which of his own sons would inherit the mantle, which would prove capable of maintaining this vast apparatus, he had already secured the Vanderbilt position in American business for generations to come. The fortune had doubled. The railroad empire was more efficient, more stable, more prosperous than ever before. And William Henry, that quiet man, that shadow of his flamboyant father, had accomplished something that would prove in retrospect to be almost equally remarkable. He had transformed his inheritance from a monument to one man's ambition into something more enduring, a carefully oiled machine that would continue, year after year, to generate wealth almost autonomously. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt's sons and grandsons came of age, the empire he had built was no longer a single man's daily labor, but a vast, intricate machine of capital and inheritance, spinning on its own momentum through an era that would come to be called the Gilded Age. The year was now the 1880s and beyond, and Fifth Avenue in New York had transformed into something altogether extraordinary. A canyon of mansions so elaborate, so dripping with ornamentation and expense, that visitors from abroad were left nearly speechless by the sheer audacity of it all. Picture, if you will, the avenue on a late autumn evening, as gas lamps flickered to life along the street. The light they cast was warm and amber, softer than electric bulbs would later be, casting everything in a honeyed glow that seemed to make the marble facades glow as though from within. These were not mere houses. They were declarations of arrival, of permanence, of a family's absolute dominion over the financial world. The Vanderbilt mansions rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories tall, their walls clad in pale limestone and granite, their windows multiplying like cells, their cornices and pediments and turrets crowding the skyline with an almost musical complexity. The architectural language spoken on Fifth Avenue was one of excess translated into stone. Classical columns borrowed from ancient Rome stood alongside the pointed arches of Gothic revival. French Renaissance chateaux were rendered in miniature, their mansard roofs and elaborate stonework speaking to the owner's travels and their desire to bring European grandeur across the Atlantic. The masonry work alone required armies of craftsmen, Italian stonemasons, French sculptors, German woodcarvers, all brought to New York to ensure that every lintel, every capital, every decorative flourish was executed with flawless precision. Step through the heavy oak doors of one of these palaces and you entered a world governed by entirely different sensory rules. The air itself felt heavier, weighted by the accumulated smell of beeswax and furniture polish, of fresh flowers arranged in vast crystal vases, roses imported in winter from greenhouses maintained at tremendous expense, lilies and orchids and blooms whose names most New Yorkers would never know. There was the faint mineral scent of marble floors, that cool smell that rises from stone, mixed always with the perfume of the ladies of the house, imported from Paris, bottled in crystal flacon stoppers, each scent a small fortune in itself. The walls inside these homes were often painted in jewel tones, deep crimsons and forest greens and midnight blues, and they were covered not with simple paper or paint alone, but with damask wallpaper, with hand-painted silk panels brought from China, with leather tooled in gold leaf. The mouldings that framed these walls were not modest trim, but elaborate architectural statements, plaster swags and garlands and acanthus leaves that seemed to tumble downward in perpetual motion, frozen forever in mid-descent. The ceilings were painted with classical scenes or left plain, but elaborately coffered, each square of the grid itself a small architectural statement. The furniture in these rooms represented the accumulated taste, or perhaps more accurately, the accumulated purchasing power of families who had hired the finest decorators and designers of the age. Here was a Louis XVI chair, its frame gilded and its cushions upholstered in velvet, the color of claret. There, a Renaissance Revival table carved from dark walnut, its surface supported by elaborately sculpted female figures, caryatids borrowed from ancient Greece and reinterpreted for the American industrial age. The rugs that covered the parquet floors were Orientals, Persians, tapestries that had been negotiated for in Constantinople or Cairo, or taken from the estates of European nobility in times of distress. And the lighting. How to describe the lighting of the Vanderbilt era without lingering on it? Chandeliers hung from the ornate ceilings, their brass arms spreading outward like trees, each arm holding a gas flame that burned with a soft hiss, casting a warm, flickering light that made the faces of the people gathered below seem to shift and move slightly, as though caught in a gentle breath. Candelabras stood on mantels and sideboards, their multiple flames multiplying the light across the polished surfaces of mirrors and gilded frames. Wall sconces in the shape of classical urns, or draped fabric, or torch-bearing cherubs held more flames, creating pools of amber light in every room, creating shadows where the light could not quite reach, creating an effect that was at once theatrical and intimate. The marble was everywhere, and marble became almost a signifier of the Vanderbilt presence, a material that spoke to their wealth in a language that required no translation. Staircases swept upward with steps hewn from single slabs of white or pink marble, their banisters carved from mahogany or iron, their newel posts topped with marble urns or gilded finials. Fireplaces were framed in marble, often with elaborate mantels that rose toward the ceiling, creating an almost ecclesiastical effect, as though the family was attending a perpetual religious service to the gods of taste and wealth. Floors were checkerboarded in marble, black and white or grey and cream, creating optical illusions that made the eye uncertain whether it was looking at a geometric pattern or a representation of depth and dimension. What is remarkable, from a distance of more than a century, is the level of intentionality that went into every detail of these spaces. There was no element of accident or negligence. The positioning of a painting, the selection of the gilt on a frame, the height of the baseboards, the particular shade of the paint on the walls, all of this was considered, debated, adjusted until it reached some standard of perfection that the family and their architects and decorators had established. To live in one of these homes was to exist in a space that had been designed with an almost obsessive attention to detail, where every surface had been thought about, where every object had been chosen for its ability to communicate something about the family's taste, their education, their connection to Europe and to culture. The domestic life of the Gilded Age Vanderbilts unfolded against this backdrop of magnificence. Dinners were served in dining rooms that could seat 40 or 50 guests, with tables laden with silver and crystal, with servants standing behind the diners' chairs, with courses arriving in predetermined succession, each one more elaborate than the last. Balls were hosted in the great halls, with orchestras playing in alcoves, with dancing that continued until dawn, with the marble floors reflecting the light of chandeliers that had been lit throughout the house. Teas were taken in parlors where conversation was the appointed activity, where young women were displayed to potential suitors and their families, where the intricate social dance of the era was performed with all the formality of a stage production. And yet, perhaps there is something almost poignant about the sensory richness of these environments, something that speaks to a human hunger for beauty and comfort that transcends the mere accumulation of wealth. The velvet was soft because people wanted softness. The marble was cool and smooth because those sensations were inherently pleasing to the human body. The light from the gas lamps was warm and flickering because there was something about that particular quality of light that made people feel seen, that made the features of their faces seem more beautiful, that created an atmosphere of intimacy even within these vast and echoing rooms. The question of whether all this beauty was justified by its cost, whether the resources expended on a single mantelpiece might have been better spent on improving the lives of the workers whose labor had created the family's wealth, would eventually become a question that occupied social critics and muckraking journalists, and indeed, members of the Vanderbilt family itself. But in the 1880s and 1890s, as these mansions rose on Fifth Avenue, and as their interiors were fitted out with ever more elaborate furnishings and decorations, such questions seemed almost beside the point. The Gilded Age was a time when the accumulation of beauty and luxury seemed to be not just permissible, but almost a moral imperative, a way of demonstrating that American civilization had reached a level of refinement equal to that of Europe, that the wealth generated by American industry could be transmuted into art and beauty and culture. The sensory experience of inhabiting these spaces, even momentarily, even for a guest invited to a ball or a dinner, must have been almost overwhelming. The combination of light and color, the smell of flowers and polish and perfume, the feel of velvet and silk against the skin, the sound of orchestras and conversation, and servants moving quietly through the corridors, the taste of elaborate meals prepared by French chefs, all of this combined to create an environment so fully realized, so complete in its appeal to the senses, that it must have felt like stepping into another world entirely, a world where the normal rules and constraints of ordinary life did not apply, where beauty and luxury were not just possible, but the fundamental reality of existence. And in a way, for the Vanderbilts and their circle, this other world was their reality. They moved through these spaces daily, so familiar with the marble and the velvet and the gaslight, that these details became almost invisible to them, the background against which the real drama of their lives, the social calculations, the marriages and engagements, the business dealings and family intrigues, was acted out. It was a world that required an enormous amount of labor to maintain, an enormous amount of money to create, and an enormous amount of human beings working behind the scenes to keep everything functioning smoothly. And yet, from the perspective of those who inhabited these spaces, it must have seemed natural, inevitable, perhaps even necessary, the only possible way that people of their station could be expected to live. The story of the Vanderbilt family wealth, vast as it was, could not simply purchase what old New York society guarded most jealously: acceptance. And it was a woman, sharp-eyed and unyielding, who would come to understand this divide more intimately than any Vanderbilt before her. Alva Smith arrived into the family through marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, bringing with her not the exhausted aristocratic pedigree that old money prized, but something that would prove far more potent, an unwavering belief that she deserved to be accepted, and the will to reshape the very rules of society to make it so. Picture, if you will, the New York of the 1870s and 80s. The city was transforming, with new wealth accumulating in the hands of industrialists and railroad magnates at a pace that bewildered the old families, the Astors and Schermerhorns and Livingstons, who had held social dominion for generations. Yet these ancient names still controlled the ultimate currency of the day, an invitation to the right drawing room, a seat at Mrs. Astor's legendary balls. The Vanderbilts, for all their millions, remained outsiders. Cornelius's fortune had been made in the rough waters of commerce, in ferry boats and steamships and iron rails, industries that had once seemed too mercenary for true gentility. His children would inherit the wealth, but they could not inherit the social standing that came with being born to it. Alva arrived as the daughter of a prominent Southern family, educated, sophisticated, and married into one of America's richest fortunes. She looked around at the frozen society of old New York and saw not an immovable establishment, but a system that simply had not yet encountered someone bold enough to challenge it. Other Vanderbilt wives had accepted their place in the shadows of Fifth Avenue's grandest families. Alva would not. Her weapon was architectural audacity. In 1882, she began planning a mansion on Fifth Avenue that would be unlike anything the city had yet seen. The architects Richard Morris Hunt, and later others, designed what came to be called the Petit Chateau, a mansion that, despite its modest French name, was anything but diminutive. Drawing inspiration from the chateau of the Loire Valley, the house was a riot of limestone towers, steeply pitched roofs, intricate carvings, and wrought iron detailing. It was, quite deliberately, the opposite of the restrained Greek Revival mansions that old money had preferred. Those houses whispered of breeding and restraint. The Petit Chateau sang of ambition and unlimited resources. The construction itself became a spectacle. Workers labored through the early 80s, with the limestone facade gradually rising on 52nd Street, drawing the eye of every New Yorker of consequence. This was not a house being built in quiet. This was a statement being carved into the very bedrock of Manhattan. Alva supervised with meticulous attention, understanding that every detail mattered: the height of the towers, the intricacy of the carvings, the arrangement of the rooms. She was not merely commissioning a home, she was architecting her own ascension. When the mansion was completed and furnished, it stood as a challenge to the old families who had never welcomed her. And then came the moment that would define her triumph. Alva threw a ball. Not just any gathering, but a costume ball of such magnificence, such extravagance and clever orchestration, that it became the talk of society. The guest list was, quite strategically, constructed as a kind of test. Those who had excluded the Vanderbilts were invited. Their daughters were invited. The evening was presented as an invitation to acknowledge the Vanderbilts' place in the social hierarchy, but it was far more subtle than a direct challenge. It was an invitation to an experience so dazzling, so exclusive in its own way, that to refuse it was to admit defeat. The night of the ball arrived, and the Petit Chateau glowed with gas lamps and candlelight, its limestone facade transformed into a stage. Guests arrived in elaborate costumes, emerging from carriages and ascending the grand staircase. Inside, the house revealed itself as something between a palace and a theatre, rooms of imposing grandeur, each decorated with breathtaking attention to detail, each designed to impress and to remind the visitor of the Vanderbilt family's resources and their aesthetic ambition. The evening unfolded with carefully planned entertainments, with dancing and conversation, with champagne and the subtle social maneuvering that was far more important than any of the obvious spectacle. What is perhaps most intriguing about this moment, and historians note this with a kind of wry appreciation, is that Alva had understood something fundamental about old money, in a way that even wealth itself could not teach. She had understood that the exclusion was not really about breeding or history. It was about control, about the power to say yes or no. By building something so undeniable, so architecturally magnificent, and socially significant, she had shifted the conversation. She was no longer asking for acceptance. She was offering something that the old families wanted: association with glamour, with artistic achievement, with the future itself. The Astors, when they appeared at that ball in the Petit Chateau, were no longer gatekeepers, they were guests. Yet it would be a mistake to suggest that Alva's victory was simple or complete. Even as she entered the drawing rooms of the most elevated families, there remained a certain coolness, a recognition that she was not quite of their world, that her success had been achieved through assertion rather than inheritance. Some whispered, with barely concealed admiration or barely concealed resentment, it is difficult to know which, that she had simply overwhelmed them with her will and her money. They accepted her, yes, but perhaps they never entirely warmed to her. And perhaps Alva did not require them to. She had proved her point. The Petit Chateau stood on Fifth Avenue as proof that the Vanderbilts had not merely purchased a place in New York society, they had purchased the ability to redefine society itself. In the decades that followed, Alva would go on to build other houses, to cement her position in ways that were both philanthropic and strategic. But it was this first great battle, fought with architects and limestone and a single perfect evening, that established the template for how a Vanderbilt could navigate the frozen world of old New York. You did not ask for admission to the club. You built your own club and made it impossible for them not to join you. The Petit Chateau still stands today, though it has been repurposed and reimagined many times over. But in the architectural memory of Manhattan, it remains what it was meant to be, not merely a mansion, but a manifesto. The clipper ships had long since given way to steamships, and the railroads had bound the nation into a continent of iron and momentum. But as Cornelius Vanderbilt's fortune swelled beyond even the most imaginative reckoning, his heirs discovered something that railway stocks and steamship certificates could never quite provide: a refuge, a place where the world's demands might soften into the rhythm of waves and salt air. That place was Newport, Rhode Island, a small coastal town that would soon transform itself into something approaching an American Versailles. By the 1880s, when William Henry Vanderbilt and his children were well established in the family's ascendant wealth, Newport had already begun its metamorphosis. What had once been a quiet fishing village and modest resort for the reasonable merchant class was becoming the summer capital of America's newly minted industrial elite. The turn toward Newport was not accidental. The ocean itself had become fashionable. The sea air was said to restore the Constitution, to clear the mind of the city's miasmas and close contacts. And perhaps more importantly, the isolation of an island town meant that one could construct palaces without the jealous eyes of the established wealthy looking on from across the street. It was Alva Vanderbilt, restless and visionary as always, who would commission the first great Vanderbilt summer palace to rise from Newport's soil. The house she envisioned was not merely a residence, it was a statement, a physical manifestation of her determination to claim a place at the pinnacle of American society. She called it Marble House, a name that suggested both elegance and an almost defiant simplicity. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, a man who had studied in Paris, who understood the language of chateau and Renaissance villas, and who possessed the gift of translating European grandeur into something that felt, somehow, almost at home in America. The construction of Marble House began in 1888, a year of particular intensity in the family's social campaigns. Workers arrived with carriages full of Italian craftsmen, specialists in marble finishing and ornamental plasterwork. The Rhode Island landscape, with its rocky outcroppings and scrub pine, yielded to the rhythmic percussion of hammers and chisels. Can you imagine the sound of it? The steady strike of tools against stone, punctuated by the distant call of gulls and the ever-present whisper of the Atlantic, visible through the trees as a pale line that would eventually frame the mansion's windows. The exterior of Marble House was constructed primarily in white marble imported from Vermont and France, a material that would gleam almost blindingly in the summer sun and catch the salt spray with a faint, crystalline patina over time. The facade drew inspiration from the Château de Versailles, though Hunt had the sensitivity to modify the grandeur into something less imposing, more inviting to the American eye. The central block rose with restrained dignity, flanked by lower pavilions. The roofline was adorned with urns and sculptural finials that cast intricate shadows in the afternoon light. But it was the interior that truly revealed Alva's aspirations and her wealth. Walking through the halls was to traverse Europe itself, or rather, to experience Europe as it existed in the imagination of the American rich, refined and selective, with all the rough edges sanded smooth. The entrance hall was a soaring rotunda, its dome rising some 50 feet overhead, painted with neoclassical motifs. The floor was paved with marble in a complex geometric pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward infinity. The Gothic room, with its vaulted ceiling and elaborate woodwork, evoked medieval tapestries and feudal grandeur. The Chinese tea room, decorated in lacquered panels of deep red and gold, spoke of the exotic trade routes that had enriched America's merchant princes. And then there was the dining room, perhaps the most theatrical of all the spaces. Its walls were clad in pale golden marble, interrupted by mirrors in ornate frames that multiplied the light of the elaborate chandeliers, creating an almost underwater sense of luminescence. It was a room designed for the display of wealth and the performance of power, where dinner parties could stretch across entire evenings, where the quality of one's china and silver and glassware became a kind of language in itself. The marble itself told a story. Each surface had been selected with meticulous care. The stone for the great staircase came from quarries in Siena, marble so fine that light seemed to pass through it slightly, as though it were translucent. The walls of the reception rooms were clad in varieties of marble from across Europe: Carrara, Champagne, Pavonazzo, each chosen not merely for its structural properties, but for the subtle variations in tone and pattern that would catch the eye and invite contemplation. Alva supervised much of this work personally, or so the family history suggests, though the reality was likely that she dictated her wishes to architects and contractors who executed her vision with the precision of a general commanding an army. She walked the grounds as they were being prepared, as gardens were laid out and stone retaining walls were built to frame the views toward the ocean. She stood in the unfinished rooms and imagined the summer nights when candles would light the windows, when orchestras would play in the drawing room, when the cream of New York and Boston society would move through these halls in a kind of elaborate dance, vying for position and acknowledgement. Marble House was completed in 1892, and it stood as something unprecedented in American architecture, a European palace that had been transplanted to an American seaside and had somehow taken root. The iron gates at the entry were gilded. The lawn swept down toward the cliff edge, where the ocean became visible in glimpses through carefully arranged trees. Walking toward the sea from the house, one would encounter the Chinese tea house, a smaller but equally ornate structure situated on a promontory above the rocks, where Alva could retire for afternoon refreshment while listening to the waves below. But Alva's triumph with Marble House was almost immediately eclipsed by an even more ambitious undertaking. Even as the plasterwork was being finished at Marble House, plans were already underway for another great mansion, this one to be built for William Kissam Vanderbilt II and his wife Alva's eldest daughter. This house would come to be known as the Breakers, and it would stand as perhaps the grandest of all American country houses, a term that seems almost laughable when applied to a structure of such overwhelming size and ambition. The Breakers was built between 1893 and 1895, rising on a dramatic point of land that jutted into the Atlantic. Where Marble House had drawn its inspiration from the chateau of the Loire Valley, the Breakers looked to Renaissance Italy, specifically to the 16th century Villa d'Este near Rome. Richard Morris Hunt returned to design this house as well, and he created what many architectural historians consider to be his masterpiece, though Hunt himself did not live to see it completed, dying in 1895 just as the final touches were being applied. The scale of the Breakers was almost overwhelming. The main facade stretched nearly 250 feet, a composition of soft-hued limestone that had been quarried in Indiana and carefully selected to achieve a particular tone of warmth and dignity. The exterior was articulated with pilasters and rustication, with windows of such size that they seemed to demand admission to every pleasure the interior might contain. Towers rose at the corners, giving the house a silhouette that was complex and dignified, never quite settling into a single impression, but rather changing as one moved around it, now appearing fortified, now palatial, now almost intimate in its proportions, though the word intimate could never truly apply to a house of nearly 180 rooms. The entrance court was approached through iron gates and down a drive that wound through carefully manicured grounds, the Atlantic always visible in the distance, glimpsed between trees and across open lawns. Standing in the entrance court, looking up at the facade of the breakers, one experienced a deliberate suspension of disbelief. This was not quite real, not quite possible, and yet there it stood, composed of Indiana limestone and Italian marble and glass, and the indomitable will of the Vanderbilt family. The interior of the breakers was, if anything, more remarkable than its exterior. The entrance hall rose through multiple stories, its walls clad in a pale marble that seemed almost warm in the light filtered through the tall windows. A grand staircase swept upward with a grace that spoke of the finest continental tradition, its balustrade carved from stone, and its steps worn to a silken smoothness by decades of footsteps. Above, a skylight flooded the space with natural illumination, and the effect was one of being simultaneously indoors and out, the boundaries between interior and exterior seeming to dissolve into pure light. The Great Hall was perhaps the most overwhelming interior space in all of American domestic architecture. This was a room that did not merely exist to serve practical purposes. It was a statement, an assertion of power and refinement, carved out of marble and decorated with frescoes and gilt. Rising nearly 70 feet overhead, its ceiling was decorated with allegorical paintings depicting the virtues of commerce and enlightenment. The walls were articulated with Corinthian pilasters of marble, and between them hung tapestries and paintings. An enormous fireplace carved from a single block of marble dominated one wall, and before it were arranged furniture pieces that seemed almost toy-like in the vastness of the room. The decoration of the breakers extended through nearly every room with an exhaustiveness that suggested an almost manic attention to detail. The dining room was a study in pale green marble and gilt, with a ceiling decorated with the muses and the virtues. The library contained not merely books but an entire architectural vocabulary derived from the Renaissance, with painted wooden panels and carved cornices. The morning room was decorated in the style of an 18th-century French salon, with pale green walls and gilt furniture. The billiard room evoked Tudor England, with dark oak paneling and heraldic decoration. And throughout it all, one was aware of the proximity of the ocean. From nearly every room, the sound of waves could be heard in the distance, a constant reminder of the landscape against which this European fantasy had been imposed. The ocean air that had drawn wealthy families to Newport in the first place was present everywhere. The faint salt tang that permeated even the most elaborately decorated interior, the way the light changed with the weather and the time of day, the sound of gulls that occasionally rose above the constant percussion of the Atlantic. The grounds of the breakers were almost as carefully orchestrated as the interior. Elaborate gardens had been designed with walks and vistas that led the eye toward the ocean, hedges. While the older Vanderbilts had staked their claims upon Fifth Avenue and the fashionable precincts of Manhattan, there existed among the family a quieter visionary, one whose ambitions turned not toward the social machinery of the city, but toward something far more expansive and solitary. George Washington Vanderbilt II, born in 1862, inherited not merely wealth, but a certain disposition toward the romantic, toward the notion that greatness could be inscribed not upon the ledgers of commerce, but upon the land itself, vast and wild and patient. In the early 1880s, when George was still a young man in his 20s, he began to acquire acreage in the mountains of western North Carolina, near the small town of Asheville. What drew him there, one might wonder, to those remote hills when he possessed access to every fashionable shore and resort in America? Perhaps it was the very remoteness itself, the possibility that in those ancient forested mountains he might construct something that reflected not the frenetic accumulation of his father and uncle, but rather a more contemplative vision of American aristocracy, one that evoked the great estates of the English countryside and the pastoral ideals that had long captivated the American imagination. The land he gathered, piece by piece, would eventually sprawl across nearly 260,000 acres. 8,000 acres immediately surrounding the house itself formed what he envisioned as the core of his creation. When one considers the geography of this terrain, the mind settles into an almost drowsy reverence. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose in long, undulating chains, their slopes clothed in dense forests of oak and hickory and Fraser fir, forests so thick that in places the sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Streams wound through the valleys, their voices a constant murmuring presence, and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of centuries, of Indian trails long abandoned, of Cherokee peoples who had once hunted these very hollows. In 1889, George commissioned the architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White, among the most celebrated designers of the Gilded Age, to conceive of a residence befitting his vision. The lead architect was Richard Morris Hunt, a man of soaring imagination who had already shaped much of the American wealthy's self-image through the chateaux and palaces he had designed. What emerged from their collaboration was something altogether extraordinary, a structure so immense, so densely ornamented with the vocabulary of the chateauesque style, that it seemed almost a small city unto itself, carved from limestone and granite. The construction would consume 6 years, from 1889 to 1895. During that time, the quiet valleys of North Carolina were transformed by the arrival of workers, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, and craftsmen who flooded into Asheville by the thousands. The sound of hammers and saws and the grinding of stone echoed through mountains that had known relative silence for generations. Railroads were extended into the region specifically to bring materials and workers to the site. Entire villages of temporary housing were erected to accommodate the labor force. It was as though George Washington Vanderbilt II had, with a flick of his pen, transplanted a piece of the Industrial Revolution directly into those ancient mountains. The central building itself, completed in 1895, rose to 250 rooms, a number so vast that it requires a moment to comprehend. There were 43 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms, a ratio that spoke to an era of luxury almost incomprehensible to most minds. The kitchen alone, one is told, occupied an entire wing of the structure. The library contained over 10,000 volumes, many of them rare editions, leather-bound and carefully preserved, their pages undisturbed for years. But beyond the mere counting of rooms and accumulation of objects, what made Biltmore distinctive was the profound silence at its heart. Not emptiness, but rather the quality of hush that comes with places built on such a scale that they exhaust the voice and invite only whispered observation. The facades of the house displayed thousands of tons of limestone, quarried and shaped with the precision of a master craftsman's hand. Turrets and chimneys rose like fingers pointing toward the sky. Steep slate roofs, in shades of grey and green, reflected the changing light as clouds passed overhead. Gargoyles and sculptural details adorned virtually every surface, an architectural language that George had absorbed during his travels through Europe and that he now caused to be translated into this remote American valley. The front entrance was approached by a drive that wound through the grounds for nearly a mile, a gradual revelation that allowed visitors to contemplate the growing scale of the structure as they drew nearer to its imposing facade. Yet what made Biltmore fundamentally different from the more nakedly aggressive displays of wealth that had proliferated on Fifth Avenue was the way in which George had embedded his creation within the landscape. He did not merely build upon the land, he sought to orchestrate it, to compose it as one might compose a symphony. He engaged the celebrated landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, the same visionary who had designed Central Park and transformed the aesthetic possibilities of American public space, to design the grounds surrounding the house. Olmsted, in his declining years, invested his considerable talents into the conception of Biltmore's landscape. He understood that a building of such magnitude could easily become a monument to hubris, a structure that dominated and diminished everything around it. Instead, he created a series of approaches and vistas that allowed the house to emerge from nature gradually, almost reluctantly. The drive wound through carefully orchestrated forests, past open meadows, beside man-made waterways and pools. The plantings were arranged to frame the house from a distance, to allow it to recede into the landscape at certain angles, to present itself as a natural culmination of the environment, rather than as an intrusion upon it. The famous banquet hall within the house rose to a height of 70 feet, its ceiling ribbed and coffered with exquisite detail, its stone walls ornamented with carved reliefs and heraldic symbols. A massive stone fireplace occupied one end of the chamber, large enough to contain an ox for roasting, and indeed, it was designed during an era when such ceremonial cooking was still conceivable, at least imaginatively. Yet even in this space of overwhelming grandeur, a kind of stillness prevailed. The very scale defeated the impulse toward frivolity. The room invited contemplation and quiet admiration rather than boisterous celebration. Beyond the central residence, Biltmore evolved into a collection of supporting structures, each conceived with meticulous care. There were formal gardens in the Italian style, with fountains and sculptured hedges precisely arranged. There were greenhouses filled with exotic plants from around the world, orchids and palms and curious specimens that had been gathered at considerable expense and effort. There was a bowling alley, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a billiards room, recreational amenities that spoke to a life of remarkable leisure. Yet the most striking feature of Biltmore, from the perspective of understanding George Washington Vanderbilt's particular vision, was perhaps the estate's vast forest holdings and the manner in which he dedicated significant resources to the scientific management and conservation of these woodlands. George had employed a young German-trained forester named Gifford Pinchot to oversee the management of the Biltmore forests according to principles of scientific forestry that were entirely novel in America at that time. Rather than viewing the forests merely as a reservoir of timber to be extracted for profit, Pinchot and Vanderbilt experimented with sustainable forestry practices, with selective harvesting, with the replanting of depleted stands, with the preservation of growth and renewal. In this way, what might have been merely a backdrop for a wealthy man's private consumption became, inadvertently, a laboratory for environmental stewardship. It was as though George's romantic impulse toward landscape had, when filtered through the lens of modern scientific management, produced something that transcended mere personal indulgence and touched upon questions of genuine historical importance. When one imagines Biltmore as it stood in the final years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, the image that emerges is almost dreamlike. The vast house rises from the mountains, its stone glowing pale in morning mist, its windows reflecting the forested slopes that surround it. Inside, gas lamps cast their warm, wavering light across ceilings of carved wood and stone. Fires burn in the great fireplaces, their smoke rising up flues that extend hundreds of feet into the night sky. The halls echo with footsteps that are ultimately swallowed by the profound acoustic properties of so vast a space. And beyond the walls, the forests breathe quietly, their darkness absolute and complete, their ancient patience unmeasured by human time. It is worth pausing here to consider what Biltmore represented within the trajectory of American wealth and aspiration. By the 1890s, the Gilded Age had produced a certain aesthetic saturation. There were palaces enough on Fifth Avenue, sufficient displays of marble and gold to satisfy the most voracious appetite for conspicuous consumption. What George Washington Vanderbilt II achieved at Biltmore was something perhaps more subtle and ultimately more profound. He demonstrated that great wealth, when allied with genuine aesthetic sensibility and a willingness to engage seriously with landscape and environment, could produce something that transcended the merely ostentatious and approached something closer to the monumental. The house became, in effect, a statement not merely about wealth, but about the possibility of cultivating beauty on an American landscape, of creating something that might endure not merely as a monument to personal fortune, but as an expression of a particular historical moment's aspirations toward grandeur and permanence. And in the grand halls of those Fifth Avenue palaces and Newport estates, beneath the glittering chandeliers and among the whispered conversations of Manhattan's elite, there lived a young woman whose life would come to embody, perhaps more than any other Vanderbilt of her generation, the strange collision between immense privilege and profound constraint. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her story moves through history like a minor key played across a grand piano, beautiful, mournful, and tinged with a certain inevitability that seems almost musical in its sadness. Born in 1877, Consuelo inherited not just her family's vast fortune, but also the accumulated weight of their social ambitions. Her mother, Alva, the same Alva who had orchestrated her own rise through society, who had built the Petit Chateau and rewritten New York's social rules through sheer force of will, had designs for her daughter that extended far beyond the shores of America. In the closing years of the 19th century, there existed among the American wealthy a peculiar hunger, a certain yearning that no amount of gold could quite satisfy. The old families of Europe, the hereditary aristocrats with their ancient titles and bloodlines stretching back through centuries of crowned heads and medieval keeps, possessed something that American money alone could not purchase. They possessed legitimacy rooted in time itself. They possessed history. They possessed nobility in the truest, most literal sense. Alva understood this profoundly, and she began, with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her rise in society, to cultivate an opportunity for her daughter. It was, in many ways, a transaction as calculated as any Cornelius Vanderbilt had ever conducted in his business affairs, though it operated according to different rules, different currencies. The currency here was not steel or shipping routes or railroad monopolies. It was blood, title, and the weight of European tradition. In 1894, when Consuelo was 17 years old, a man arrived in New York whose presence rippled through society like a stone dropped into still water. His name was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, heir to Blenheim Palace, one of the greatest estates in all of England, and representative of a lineage that traced itself back through the pages of English history with an authority that made even the wealthiest Americans feel, by comparison, like sudden arrivals. The Duke was 38 years old, considerably older than his prospective bride, and he was, according to contemporary accounts, in genuine financial distress. The ancestral estates, magnificent as they were, required enormous sums for their maintenance. Taxes were rising. The income from traditional estates was declining. The careful management of generations could not sustain Blenheim Palace as it had been sustained in previous centuries. Enter Alva Vanderbilt, with her daughter, her fortune, and her fierce determination. The negotiations proceeded with the dispassion of a business merger, though few would have spoken of it in such terms publicly. There were visits arranged. There were formal introductions. There were conversations held in drawing rooms where the evening light filtered through lace curtains and the air itself seemed to shimmer with consequence. And through it all, one must wonder, and it is a question that historians have asked themselves with genuine tenderness for more than a century, what was Consuelo feeling? For what was Consuelo, after all, but a young woman in her late teens, educated according to the careful prescriptions of her class, trained in languages and music, and the management of household affairs, yet possessed of no particular say in the direction her own life would take. She had been raised in many ways as an heirloom. She was beautiful, certainly. She was cultured. She was desirable precisely because of her family's position and resources. But what she wanted, what she felt, what her own interior landscape contained, these seem to have been treated as secondary considerations at best. There are accounts, tucked away in letters and later in memoirs written by Consuelo herself, that hint at her awareness of what was occurring. One can sense, between the careful lines of Victorian propriety, a quiet recognition of the machinery set in motion around her. She was to be, in essence, a purchase. Her dowry, which some accounts place at the extraordinary figure of $10 million, though the true sum remains uncertain, lost in the discretion with which such transactions were conducted, would flow from America to England, from the Vanderbilt vaults to the maintenance of Blenheim's ancient stones and its precious contents. In return, she would receive a title. She would become the Duchess of Marlborough. She would enter the circles of British aristocracy, not as an outsider, not as American money-seeking acceptance, but as a legitimate member of the English peerage. It was, in the mathematics of her mother's ambition, a reasonable exchange. And so, as 1895 dawned, preparations began for what would be one of the great society weddings of the age. Consuelo Vanderbilt, granddaughter of the Commodore, daughter of the woman who had remade New York society according to her own vision, would marry an English duke. The romantic narrative that surrounded this union, woven by contemporary newspapers and popular accounts, cast it as a triumph, a true love story, a culmination of the democratic American dream in which even a Vanderbilt might rise to become a duchess. But one wonders, in the quiet hours before sleep comes, whether anyone asked Consuelo how she truly felt. What emerges from the historical record, from her own later writings, and the accounts of those close to her, is a picture considerably more complex and considerably more painful than the triumphant narrative presented at the time. There are hints, delicate and careful, that Consuelo had harbored affections for another man, a young man named Winthrop Rutherford, who occupied a respected position in New York society, but lacked the title, the ancestry, and certainly the financial arrangements that a duke could bring. When her mother discovered this attachment, the response was swift and absolute. Alva would not hear of such a match. The opportunity before them was too great. The stakes were too high. Consuelo's personal feelings, however genuine they might be, were obstacles to be overcome, not considerations to be honored. There is a particularly poignant account, recorded in Consuelo's later memoir, in which she describes a confrontation with her mother on this very subject. Alva, we are told, was not unkind, precisely, but she was immovable. She placed the weight of the family's ambitions, the magnitude of what was being arranged, directly upon her daughter's shoulders. Consuelo was reminded of her duty, of the honor being conferred upon her, of the extraordinary nature of the opportunity. She was reminded, implicitly if not explicitly, of what she owed to her family. And in that moment, with the inexorable force of maternal will pressing down upon her, Consuelo acquiesced. She agreed to the marriage. She agreed to the transaction. She agreed to have her life redirected according to plans made by others, even as her own heart yearned in a different direction. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. The spectacle was extraordinary. The church was filled with the most prominent members of New York society. The newspapers devoted enormous amounts of coverage to the event. Consuelo wore an elaborate gown of white satin and old lace, and she carried orange blossoms, and she walked the aisle on her father's arm toward a man whom she had been persuaded, rather than chosen, to marry. One must ask oneself, in contemplating this moment, what was she experiencing beneath the careful mask of social propriety? What thoughts occupied her mind as she moved through those ceremonial motions? After the wedding, Consuelo departed for England, for Blenheim Palace, for her new life as a duchess. She left behind her family, her native country, and the possibility of a different future. She entered into a marriage that, while not without its moments of companionship or mutual respect, was fundamentally a contract rather than a love match. The Duke, we are told, was not a cruel man, but he was not particularly affectionate either. He had married for money, as was openly understood. Consuelo had been married for duty, as was expected of her, and together they would proceed to conduct their lives according to the intricate protocols of English aristocratic society, performing their roles with the careful precision of actors who understand the script entirely too well. What makes Consuelo's story linger in the mind, what gives it a particular resonance even now, more than a century later, is this. It raises questions about privilege itself. Here was a woman with unimaginable material wealth, with access to every luxury the world could offer, with a social position that most could never aspire to attain. And yet, she possessed very little control over the fundamental architecture of her own existence. Her beauty, her money, her intelligence, her accomplishments, all of these were channeled into service of ambitions that were not her own. She was, in a very real sense, a commodity, an extraordinarily valuable commodity to be sure, but a commodity nonetheless. In later life, Consuelo would eventually separate from her husband, an act that scandalized society in its own time, though it is treated almost casually in contemporary accounts. She lived a long life. She would survive into the 1960s, and she filled it with various pursuits: writing, political activism, work on behalf of those she felt were less fortunate than herself. Whether she found happiness in these later pursuits, whether she ever genuinely shed the weight of that arranged marriage and the choices made for her, is a question that seems to linger beyond the boundaries of historical certainty. But what we can say is this: her story, the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, serves as a kind of mirror. It reflects back to us the strange paradox at the heart of the Vanderbilt Empire. All that wealth, all that power, all that influence, and yet, in many ways, those who possessed it were themselves constrained by the very systems that had granted it to them in the first place. They were bound by expectations, by duty, by the weight of family ambition in ways that are perhaps difficult for us, living in our era of ostensible choice and self-determination, to fully comprehend. There exists a moment in the vast ledger of the Vanderbilt family's history where wealth and fortune could not shield against the indifference of fate, where no railroad or steamship line could redirect the course of human tragedy. It is a story that belongs to Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, a man born into the full bloom of the family's Gilded Age splendor, whose name would become eternally intertwined with one of the 20th century's most haunting maritime disasters. Alfred was born in 1877, the great-great-grandson of the Commodore himself, though by the time of his own adulthood, the family no longer trafficked in the rough waters of direct commerce. Instead, Alfred inherited yachts rather than ferries, inherited society balls rather than business councils, inherited the weight of expectation that came with simply bearing the Vanderbilt name, in an era when that name opened every door in New York society. He was known by most accounts as a man of some charm and considerable generosity, a sportsman who understood horses and hunting, a gentleman who moved comfortably through the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and the summer retreats of Newport. On the morning of May 7, 1915, Alfred boarded the RMS Lusitania in New York, bound for Liverpool on what was meant to be a routine transatlantic crossing. The world was already at war, though America still held to its careful neutrality, watching from across the ocean as Europe tore itself asunder. The Lusitania, one of the great Cunard liners, was considered a marvel of engineering and speed, a vessel that had captured the blue riband for fastest Atlantic crossing, a ship that many believed moved so swiftly through the waters that no enemy submarine could possibly touch it. Such beliefs, we might reflect now, contained within them the seeds of tragedy. The weather that morning had been grey and heavy. The waters off the Irish coast were quiet, almost deceptively so, and the passengers settled into the rhythms of shipboard life, conversations in the dining saloons, the gentle sway of the vessel beneath them, the distant thrum of the ship's mighty turbines. Alfred had a first-class cabin, of course. He had booked passage along with his valet, a man named Ronald Denyer, and among his fellow travellers were artists, businessmen, women travelling to see husbands and sons stationed in Britain, families seeking safety, and others simply resuming the interrupted rhythms of peacetime commerce. What neither Alfred nor any of the other passengers could have known was that a German U-boat, the SEM U-20, was lying in wait in those same waters, captained by a man named Walther Schwieger. This was warfare of a kind the modern world had never quite seen before. Invisible death rising from beneath the waves, hunting merchant vessels and passenger ships alike. The ship's captain, William Turner, was aware of the threat, though the full extent of the danger remained opaque. Cunard had sent warnings to the ship, suggestions that it follow a particular course, hints about enemy submarines in the area. But the Lusitania, so sleek and swift, was believed by many to be unsinkable in the practical sense. It was too fast. It was too grand. Surely nothing could bring down such a vessel. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as many passengers were still at lunch or resting in their cabins, the U-20 released a torpedo. There would be debates for years afterward about what happened in the moments that followed, about whether it was one torpedo or two, about what secondary explosions might have occurred, about the nature of the cargo hidden in the ship's hold. There would be investigations and inquiries, and historical arguments that persist even now, more than a century later. But what is certain is that the Lusitania, that modern marvel of engineering, began to sink. The chaos that unfolded in those next minutes and hours was of a kind that exists almost beyond comprehension. More than 1,200 people died in the disaster, many of them civilians, many of them women and children. The waters of the Irish coast, so grey that morning, turned dark with tragedy. Lifeboats were insufficient, launched with terrible haste, some of them overturned in the panic. Those in the water faced the shock of the cold Atlantic, faced the awful mathematics of survival when there is simply not enough space for everyone who wishes to live. Alfred Vanderbilt, we are told by those who investigated the disaster, displayed remarkable composure in the face of what was clearly catastrophe. He gave up his place in a lifeboat to a woman, a gesture that speaks to some code of honor and duty that persisted even in the face of death itself. There are accounts that suggest he helped others, that he moved through the chaos with a kind of quiet dignity, that his last actions were consistent with a life of privilege that had perhaps instilled in him some sense of obligation to those less fortunate. Whether we can know the precise truth of those final moments is something that historians must approach with humility, for the dead do not return to corroborate their own stories, and the survivors were themselves traumatized and uncertain in their recollections. What we do know is that Alfred Vanderbilt died in the sinking of the Lusitania, one among more than 1,000 others who perished when that great ship slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic. His body was never recovered. No fortune, no name, no connection to the great Vanderbilt empire could alter that outcome. The richest families in America cannot purchase immunity from history's gravest moments. The sinking of the Lusitania shocked the world in ways that reverberated far beyond the immediate tragedy. It was a moment in which the brutality of modern industrial warfare became viscerally apparent, in which the technology that had promised to connect the world and facilitate commerce also became a weapon that killed indiscriminately. The sinking would contribute, though not alone, to growing American sentiment against Germany and would eventually help shift American public opinion toward intervention in a war that had seemed so distant only moments before. For the Vanderbilt family, the loss of Alfred was a different kind of reckoning. Yes, they remained wealthy. Yes, the fortune continued to flow, the estates continued to stand, the railroads continued to carry passengers and goods across the American landscape. But the loss of a family member, and under such terrible circumstances, introduced a note of gravity into a family history that had otherwise been largely concerned with the accumulation of beauty and status and material grandeur. It was a reminder that even families such as theirs existed within the larger currents of human history, that no amount of privilege could entirely separate them from the tragedies that befell humanity more broadly. The Lusitania disaster became, in some respects, a dividing line. It marked the end of a particular kind of innocence, a time before the full machinery of modern warfare had demonstrated its capacity for indiscriminate destruction. In the decades that followed, the Vanderbilt family would witness the slow decline of the railroad age, the erosion of the particular kind of industrial dominance that the Commodore had built, the transformation of American society in ways that would have seemed unimaginable even to the eyes of those who witnessed Alfred's era. But before that slow decline, before the transformations that would eventually humble even the greatest fortunes, the family would experience one more generation of monumental ambition, one more flowering of the Gilded Age sensibility, a final moment when the Vanderbilts could still believe that their wealth and taste and influence might be sufficient to shape the world according to their vision. And yet, for all the grandeur that rose from Vanderbilt ambition, for all the mansions that crowned hilltops and the railroads that stitched the continent together, there existed a quieter current running through the family story. A current that suggested the Vanderbilts, despite their reputation for ruthlessness, their consolidation of wealth, their glittering social triumphs, were also moved by something deeper than acquisition. They were moved by the possibility of permanence through generosity, of immortality through the institutions they founded and sustained. This is perhaps one of the most profound paradoxes of vast inherited wealth in America, that the same families who built their fortunes on competition and leverage often felt compelled, in their later years or through their children, to give those fortunes away in ways designed to outlast them, to create monuments not of marble, but of human knowledge and cultural refinement. Consider the genesis of Vanderbilt University in Nashville. The year was 1864, and the Civil War had only recently ceased its terrible work. The institution that became Vanderbilt began, humbly enough, as the Central University of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. When the university faced dissolution, its resources depleted, its future uncertain in the chaos of Reconstruction, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore himself, now in his final years, made a gift of $1 million. $1 million. In 1864, such a sum was almost incomprehensible to the ordinary citizen. It was not the largest gift he made, but it carried a weight of intention. The university was renamed in his honor, and though the Commodore would not live to see it flourish, he had ensured that higher education would bear the Vanderbilt name in the American South, a region he had helped to connect through his railroads, and a region struggling to rebuild. What drew Cornelius Vanderbilt to this particular cause? Historians gently debate whether his motivations were purely philanthropic or whether they were, as was often the case with the magnates of his era, entangled with questions of legacy and reputation. Perhaps both truths held space within him simultaneously. Perhaps a man who had spent 70 years pursuing wealth and dominance might, as death approached, begin to wonder what would remain of himself when he was gone. A university bearing his name would educate countless young minds. Doctors would graduate from Vanderbilt, lawyers, engineers, teachers. In some quiet way, the Commodore's influence would extend into the 20th century and beyond, not through his individual presence, he would be dust, but through the institution he had catalyzed into being. The university itself began a slow transformation from its Methodist origins towards something broader, something more secular and intellectually ambitious. By the late 1800s, Vanderbilt University had become a center of learning, a place where the South's intellectual elite could gather and think. It was a tangible legacy, visible, functional, perpetually renewing itself with each new generation of students who walked its halls and sat in its libraries, unaware necessarily that they were beneficiaries of one old man's decision to convert capital into educational possibility. But Vanderbilt University was far from the only institution shaped by the family's wealth and vision. William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's eldest son who inherited the greatest portion of his fortune, was moved by different aspirations than his father. Where Cornelius had been elemental, direct, sometimes brutal in his acquisition, William Henry was more diffuse in his influence. He collected art with a passion that bordered on obsession. He amassed one of the finest private collections in America: paintings, sculptures, tapestries from European masters, Japanese ceramics, medieval manuscripts. And when he died in 1885, his heirs faced the question of what would become of this extraordinary collection. Rather than allow the pieces to scatter across the auction houses of Europe and America, as so often happened with the holdings of the wealthy, the family made a different choice. They donated significant portions of their collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, an institution that was itself still finding its footing, still establishing itself as a repository of human cultural achievement. The Metropolitan, which stands today on the edge of Central Park like a grand temple to human creativity, was profoundly shaped by Vanderbilt generosity. Walk through the galleries now and encounter Egyptian mummies, Greek vases, medieval armor, Renaissance paintings. Many of them arrived at the Met through gifts traced directly or indirectly to the Vanderbilt family's acquisitions and donations. There is a peculiar alchemy involved in such transactions. When a private collector donates their possessions to a public museum, they are saying something profound about the nature of beauty and knowledge. They are saying that these objects, which once hung in private drawing rooms, should be available to all who enter the museum's doors. The carefully curated world of the mansion becomes, through such donation, democratized. How many people have stood before a painting that once hung in a Vanderbilt home, not knowing its provenance, simply moved by its beauty or its historical significance? In that moment, the boundary between private wealth and public good becomes blurred, becomes nearly invisible. The Metropolitan was not alone in receiving such attentions. The American Museum of Natural History benefited from Vanderbilt resources. Libraries were endowed, museums were founded. The Vanderbilt name began to appear on the walls of cultural institutions across America, not always as the primary dedicatory name, but woven into the fabric of their support and growth. This pattern repeated across the family network. George Washington Vanderbilt, the reclusive millionaire who had built Biltmore in the North Carolina mountains, was himself interested in the preservation of forests and the advancement of forestry as a science. His vast estates incorporated progressive agricultural and forestry practices. He established schools and supported research, turning parts of his domain into something approximating an experiment in enlightened land stewardship. What should we make of this constellation of giving? One might argue, with some justice, that philanthropy of this sort is merely enlightened self-interest, that wealthy families use charitable giving as a means of controlling their legacy and ensuring that their names are remembered not just for the acquisition of wealth, but for the appearance of virtue. The gifts were tax-advantaged. The institutions that received them became associated with the names of their donors, ensuring a kind of eternal presence. The American civic imagination would forever link Vanderbilt with education, with art, with culture. And yet, the institutions themselves, the university, the museums, the libraries, have taken on lives of their own. They have outlasted the initial generosity that birthed them. Vanderbilt University, in the 21st century, operates according to its own logic, governed by its own boards of trustees, pursuing its own intellectual mission. The students who walk its campus come from around the world. Many of them have never heard the Commodore's story. The institution has become larger than the intention that created it, more democratic, more widely distributed in its effects. The original motivation of any single donor, no matter how wealthy, fades into the architecture and the curriculum and the lives shaped by education. There is something restful about contemplating this, is there not? The idea that ambition and accumulation, pressed forward long enough and converted into the right kinds of structures, can eventually transcend themselves. That a man like the Commodore, who spent so much of his energy competing, dominating, outsmarting rivals, could eventually find a way to contribute to something larger than competition. A university educates people who will compete with each other, certainly, but also collaborate, create, discover. The logic shifts from pure accumulation to something else, to the slow accumulation of human knowledge and capacity. The Vanderbilts were not uniquely philanthropic among the wealthy magnates of the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie gave away nearly his entire fortune to libraries and educational institutions. Rockefeller funded medical research and public health initiatives. Henry Clay Frick endowed museums and art collections. There was a particular ideology, loosely denominated the gospel of wealth, which suggested that those who had accumulated great fortunes had a moral obligation to return that wealth to society in the form of culture, education, and social improvement. Whether this ideology was genuinely held, or whether it was rationalization after the fact, a way of reconciling the ruthlessness of capital accumulation with the moral anxieties of men who had been taught to believe in Christian virtue, is something historians still gently debate. But the Vanderbilts, at least in the persons of William Henry and his descendants, seemed genuinely committed to the project of cultural and educational stewardship. They did not simply give money once and claim credit. They remained engaged, interested, involved in the institutions they supported. They continued to add to collections, to underwrite research, to endow professorships. There was a sustained commitment, a kind of long-form dedication to the idea that wealth could be converted into something lasting. And perhaps that is the image worth holding as we contemplate this chapter of the Vanderbilt story. Not the image of acquisition, not the image of competition and dominance, but the quieter image of giving. The image of walking through a museum gallery, or sitting in a university lecture hall, or pulling a carefully preserved book from a library shelf, and doing so because someone, generations ago, decided that such things mattered enough to fund, to preserve, to make available. The Vanderbilts built an empire, yes, but they also built institutions that would outlast any individual empire, that would serve purposes larger than any single family or any single generation's ambitions. What becomes of an empire when the force that built it finally rests? The Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it appeared beneath the gaslit chandeliers of those Fifth Avenue palaces, was subject to the same quiet erosion that eventually claims all great accumulations of wealth, and the story of its gentle, then accelerating decline is not one of sudden collapse, but rather of 1,000 small choices, each sensible in its moment, each pulling the family's resources in different directions, until the singular vision that Cornelius had possessed, that absolute focus on accumulation and consolidation, had splintered into inheritance, into competing interests, into the simple mathematics of division. When Cornelius Vanderbilt the Elder died in 1877, his will sparked immediate surprise. He had left the bulk of his estate, some $90 million in total, to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. It was a concentration of wealth rather than a scattering of it, a deliberate choice to keep the empire intact. And William Henry, though less flamboyant than his father, proved himself a capable steward. He doubled that fortune in his own lifetime, expanding the railroad interests, diversifying into other ventures, and managing the Vanderbilt properties with a steady hand. Yet even as William Henry preserved and grew the wealth, the seeds of fragmentation were already germinating. His own will, written in the knowledge that he had 5 living children, faced the inevitable question, how to divide what had taken a lifetime to consolidate. William Henry chose a different path than his father. Rather than concentrating the bulk of his estate in a single heir, he divided his fortune more broadly among his children, believing that each should receive a substantial inheritance. This was, in many ways, an act of love, a desire to ensure that each child could live in comfort and security. And yet historians have long wondered whether it was also the moment when the singular focus that had defined the Vanderbilt empire began to diffuse. The fortune that had been wielded as a unified force, a single consciousness directing the vast machinery of rails and ships and real estate, was now split into 5 separate fortunes, 5 separate wills, 5 separate visions of how Vanderbilt wealth should be deployed. Consider for a moment the practical implications. A railroad empire, to maintain its dominance, requires constant attention, constant reinvestment, constant expansion to keep pace with rivals. When that empire is controlled by one man with one vision, these decisions flow from a single mind. But when the inheritance is divided, each heir must decide independently what to do with their portion. Some invested heavily in their properties and their social position. Others turned toward philanthropy. Still others simply allowed their fortunes to be managed by trustees and advisors, stepping back from the active business of empire building. The entrepreneurial impulse that had animated Cornelius Vanderbilt, that restless drive to accumulate, to expand, to dominate his chosen sphere, was less common among his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They were heirs to a fortune, not builders of one, and that is a fundamentally different relationship to wealth. The railroads themselves, meanwhile, were undergoing their own transformation. By the turn of the 20th century, the age of the railroad robber baron was waning. Regulations were increasing. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established in 1887, began imposing rules and restrictions on railroad operations. Antitrust legislation loomed. The absolute power that a man like Cornelius Vanderbilt had wielded in the 1870s became increasingly constrained. A Vanderbilt heir in the 1920s or 1930s inherited not the unbounded opportunity that the Commodore had seized, but rather a heavily regulated industry in which the possibilities for expansion and dominance were far more limited. And beyond the railroads, new industries were emerging that demanded capital and attention. The automobile was transforming American transportation. Aviation was beginning. Oil and electricity and communications were reshaping the landscape of American business. The Vanderbilt family, firmly established in railroads, found themselves watching from the sidelines as new fortunes were being made in sectors they had not anticipated or entered. The inheritance tax, too, began to exert its own quiet pressure. When William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, estate taxes did not yet exist in America. But by the early 20th century, as the nation began to grapple with questions of inequality and social responsibility, taxation of great fortunes became policy. Each generation, as inheritances passed down, saw a portion claimed by the government. The $90 million that Cornelius had accumulated, then the $180 million that William Henry had amassed, began to shrink with each succession. Not dramatically at first, but persistently. The growth that had characterized the Vanderbilt wealth in the 19th century, the endless accumulation, began to slow, then to plateau. And there was, perhaps, a psychological dimension to this decline as well. Wealth accumulated through ruthless competition, through the accumulation of competitive advantage, often carries with it a kind of energy, a hunger. The Commodore had stared down rivals. William Henry had managed the machinery of empire with calm efficiency, but their heirs and their heirs' heirs were inheriting comfort, social position, the ability to live as they wished. The hunger that drives continued accumulation and aggressive business competition, does it pass through the bloodline, or does it dissipate when comfort is assured? The question hangs unanswered, as it has for many great family fortunes. Some Vanderbilt descendants maintained interests in business, others turned entirely toward leisure, toward the management of their estates and their social calendars. The force that had built the empire was no longer present to direct it. The stock market collapse of 1929 struck another blow, though it must be said that the Vanderbilts, by then thoroughly entrenched in established wealth, weathered the depression better than many Americans. Yet the event was symbolic, a moment when the great fortunes of the Gilded Age seemed suddenly fragile, contingent upon forces beyond any individual's control. The Vanderbilt wealth did not vanish, but it receded. Where once a Vanderbilt was among the richest people in America, by mid-century they were merely very wealthy. Their fortunes diluted through inheritance and investment decisions. Their relative position in American society subtly but perceptibly diminished. Consider the practical reality of family property. The great Fifth Avenue mansion where Cornelius had ruled over his empire, and where William Henry had managed it. That building was eventually sold in 1945. The costs of maintaining it, the changing character of Fifth Avenue itself, the tax implications, the simple fact that no single Vanderbilt of the post-war generation had either the wealth or the inclination to maintain it as a private residence. All these factors converged. The house was demolished in 1953, replaced by an office building. It was not a dramatic fall, but a quiet accommodation to changing times. The Newport mansions, the Biltmore estate, these survived, but increasingly as relics, maintained by trusts or historical societies rather than as primary residences of an active, engaged family. By the second half of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt name had become almost quaint in American business. There were no Vanderbilt captains of industry anymore. The railroad industry itself had contracted and consolidated in ways that would have been unimaginable to Cornelius. The family's remaining wealth was substantial. There are still Vanderbilt descendants of considerable means, but it no longer commanded the attention of the nation, no longer shaped the development of major industries, no longer represented the cutting edge of American economic ambition. What had caused this decline? It was not in the end any single catastrophic failure. It was rather the accumulated effect of multiple forces, inheritance divided among multiple children, regulatory changes that constrained the railroads that had been the source of the family's power, new industries rising in which the Vanderbilts had no particular advantage, taxation that gradually claimed a larger share of inherited wealth with each generation, and perhaps most fundamentally, a shift in the very nature of American capitalism. The era of the self-made robber baron, the individual who could build an empire through force of will and competitive ruthlessness, seemed to recede. Corporate structures became more complex. Management became more professionalized. It was an age less suited to the Vanderbilt genius, if genius it was, than to the organizational abilities of hired executives and boards of directors. The gradual decline of the Vanderbilt fortune, then, was not tragedy, but merely the working out of economic law, the inevitable consequence of great wealth being converted into many lesser wealths, of empire being converted into inheritance, of a singular driving force being dispersed into the multitude of ordinary human choices that follow it. It is a gentle lesson in the nature of fortune itself, and in the ways that all great accumulations of wealth must eventually yield to time, to taxation, to the simple human desires of those who inherit rather than create. The morning light falls differently now on the streets where the Vanderbilts once commanded empires. If you were to walk down Fifth Avenue today, past the sites where their mansions once rose like cathedrals of wealth, you would find something altogether quieter than the gilded splendor that marked the 19th century. Where Alva Vanderbilt's chateau once commanded the block, where limestone and ornamental iron spoke of unlimited fortune, there stands instead the fabric of the contemporary city, offices, apartments, the measured pace of ordinary life flowing past. The space where that ambition crystallized into architecture has been absorbed, transformed, become simply part of the fabric, and there is something almost restful in that surrender. But the empire has not entirely faded. It persists, instead, in fragments, in rooms where silence now gathers like dust, in spaces held in trust by those who recognize the value of preservation, of bearing witness to what once was. The Vanderbilt mansions that remain stand as museums now, open to visitors who move through their halls with a hushed reverence, their footsteps echoing in rooms that once echoed with orchestras and conversation. The Met Breuer building, housing exhibitions that shift with the seasons, stands on the site of a Vanderbilt residence. Art flows through the spaces where family legacy once flowed like an invisible current. There is a gentle poetry in that exchange, perhaps. Wealth transformed into culture, into knowledge freely available to anyone who passes through a door. In Rhode Island, the breakers still commands the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. But now, thousands of visitors move through its halls each year, their wonder at the marble staircase and the morning room reflecting back to us something about American aspiration itself. The ocean air still moves through those rooms, salt-tinged and cool, carrying the same sound that would have carried to Cornelius Vanderbilt's ears when he stood on the decks of his steamships. The waves continue their ancient rhythm, indifferent to the fortunes built and crumbled nearby. Marble House rests nearby, its gilded interiors a testament to a particular moment in American history when European grandeur felt like something to be captured, preserved, replicated in stone and precious metal. The gardens, maintained with care, offer moments of stillness. People walk there now without urgency, without the pressure of social obligation that once drove Alva's endless entertaining and positioning. The flowers bloom regardless of the passage of dynasties. Biltmore, nestled in the mountains of North Carolina, has perhaps found a more graceful kind of immortality. The estate now functions as both home to a few descendants and living museum, its grounds open to visitors who wander through the same rooms where George Washington Vanderbilt II once entertained guests, where his children played in halls that seemed to stretch endlessly. The forest still surrounds it, as it did more than a century ago. The mountains hold the same silence they held before the mansion was built, and will hold long after current inhabitants have passed. The banquet hall, where gaslight once flickered off silver and crystal, now receives visitors whose voices rise and echo in awe. There is something fundamentally human in that wonder, in standing in a space designed for grandeur, and feeling its weight, its attempted permanence. Vanderbilt University, in Nashville, carries the family name forward into an entirely different realm. Students move through its buildings each day, absorbing education, building their own futures, some of them perhaps unaware that the institution bearing this name was founded with railroad money, with wealth accumulated across the troubled waters of the Hudson River and the contested landscapes of American industry. The university represents, in a way, the Vanderbilt legacy transformed into something more diffuse, more democratic. Knowledge as inheritance, offered to generations who never knew the family themselves. The libraries hold millions of volumes. The classrooms echo with learning. What once might have been the pursuit of a single family, accumulation, status, the building of something that would endure, has become something that belongs to many. Do you wonder what the builders of these empires would have thought? Could they witness how their fortunes have been dispersed, distributed, democratized, across institutions and public spaces? It seems unlikely they could have imagined a world in which their names adorned universities and museums, rather than factories and rail lines exclusively. Yet perhaps in some deeper way, they might recognize the impulse, the desire to build something that would outlast them, that would matter. The form has simply shifted. The ambition, in some form, persists. The railroad lines that Cornelius Vanderbilt consolidated and fought to control no longer carry quite the same weight in American life. The trains still run, but they have been overtaken by highways and airways and the vast invisible networks of digital commerce. The locomotives that once seemed like the future now occupy heritage railways and transport enthusiasts seeking connection to a previous era. The Grand Central Terminal, that magnificent structure birthed from Cornelius's vision and built by the workers whose names we do not remember, still functions. Commuters still pass through its vast hall, though most move quickly, absorbed in the present moment, perhaps not pausing to consider the history embedded in every vault and column. The clock still ticks, the light still filters through the windows. It remains a gathering place, though the gathering itself has shifted in character and scale. What remains of the Vanderbilt Empire, then, is not so much a unified whole as a dispersal, a scattering across the landscape, across institutional memory, across the accumulated wisdom of universities, the aesthetic legacy of restored mansions, the public good served by cultural institutions. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age were built on an assumption that they would remain concentrated, that they would define and dominate the centuries to follow. And yet the very forces that allowed Cornelius Vanderbilt to accumulate such staggering wealth, the flow of capital, the relentless tide of competition and innovation, the expansion and transformation of industry, eventually diluted that legacy across generations and into realms that the original builders might not have anticipated. The quiet gardens of Marble House face the ocean under cloud cover, as they do on so many days along that coast. The sea spray continues to find its way across the grounds, salting the carefully cultivated roses and ornamental shrubs. The gardeners still maintain them, still understand the intention behind every hedge and pathway. But the garden exists now for visitors, for education, for the preservation of a particular moment in American history. The urgency that Alva Vanderbilt felt, the desperate scramble for social position and acceptance, has been gentled by time into something we might call legacy, something we can view with distance and understanding rather than live within with the pressure of immediate competition. In the archives of these institutions, documents rest in climate-controlled rooms, letters written by Vanderbilt hands, ledgers recording transactions whose amounts would seem almost incomprehensible to people moving through contemporary life. Photographs capture moments now more than a century past, gatherings, ceremonies, the faces of people whose lives were shaped entirely by the circumstances of their birth into immense wealth. Historians and researchers move through these collections, attempting to understand the era, to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence a sense of what it meant to live during the Gilded Age, to possess that kind of power and position. Perhaps there is consolation in the understanding that even empires built on such scale, such ambition, such seemingly permanent foundations eventually fold into history. The Vanderbilt name persists, not because the family continues to command industries, but because their buildings remain, because their decisions ripple forward through institutions, because the wealth they accumulated found paths into culture and education and public good. The iron-fisted control that Cornelius exercised over railroad lines could not prevent the ultimate democratization of his legacy. The social triumphs that Alva engineered could not prevent the transformation of her mansions into spaces for public benefit. Time has the final word on all empires, and time perhaps is gentler than any single individual could ever be. As evening settles over these sites now, as gas has long since been replaced by electric light, and that electric light has been supplemented by the soft glow of modern preservation techniques, there is a kind of peace in it. The breakers stand solid against the Atlantic evening. The Biltmore settles into its mountain shadows. The Grand Central Terminal continues its quiet humming, its endless choreography of arrivals and departures. None of these spaces exerts the pressure they once did. None of them demands that we remake ourselves in their image or surrender to their logic. They simply exist. They persist. They offer themselves for understanding, for reflection, for the quiet appreciation of human ambition crystallized into lasting form. The story of the Vanderbilt Empire is, in many ways, the story of America itself, of individual ambition and collective transformation, of fortunes made and eventually redistributed, of the slow movement of private accumulation toward public good. It is a story that does not end in triumph or defeat, but rather in a kind of gentle accommodation, a dissolution not into irrelevance but into legacy. And as you settle deeper into the quietness of your own evening, you might imagine those great halls emptying of visitors, the lights dimming room by room, the ocean continuing its patient work at the cliffs of Rhode Island, the mountains of North Carolina holding their ancient silence around the great house resting within them. The empire persists but transformed, quieted, offering not power or prestige, but understanding, offering to those who come with curiosity a glimpse of what was built, what was lost, and what endures. And in that endurance, perhaps, a kind of peace,